Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It is Thursday, August 5th, Vince, and today the Notre Dame football players showed up for camp. So season officially kind of going. Today is report day, which is you can remember as a coach or as a player, as a coach in college. It's that day where kids come from all over the country and they kind of show up and it's time to go. It's time to rock and roll. So they'll have a couple days of making sure everything is set. They'll have meetings. They'll get their equipment. They'll do all that kind of fun stuff, get set up on their campus housing, all those type of things. And then camp will start on Saturday. So it is upon us, Vince. It is upon us. And, of course, how Notre Dame does this season is going to be determined by how many of their opponents they beat. So you might have an obvious moment. So today we're going to break down Cincinnati and Wisconsin, or Wisconsin and then Cincinnati, which is Notre Dame's next two opponents. It's really the first two opponents, Vince, that you look at and say, okay, now you get into that part of the season where you have to really play well to win. You know, the first three games, they're all capable of beating Notre Dame, but in some instances it would require just a disaster from Notre Dame, and others it would have to require Notre Dame to not play very well. These are games where you could bring your B-plus game, and still get beat in certain areas. So this is when the schedule gets very, very interesting. And just a quick note about today's show. We have some, as you could tell by the fact that we started late, we have very busy days today. We have a lot going on. And so today's show, we apologize that we're getting a late start. Today's show is just going to be us doing the podcast portion. We're not going to have a Q&A afterwards. We'll answer questions as we're talking about things. If we see something pertinent to what we're discussing, we may pull it up just to kind of add what we're saying. If there's something you really want to get asked, then, obviously you can leave a super chat, but we'll obviously make it up to you tomorrow. We are going to have all day tomorrow to do our Friday mailbag. So I know Vince is excited about that.
Always best day of the week.
So we apologize that today's going to be a little bit of a shorter show. We're just going to stick to these two topics, but it's very important topics because this is when we're really going to start to find out, Vince, how good this Notre Dame football team is going to be.
Well, yeah, and I think, we talk about, schedule breakdown, and I believe we've had a show about that, or maybe we've talked about it. I can't remember, but we've talked about how there's
been so long that they've just kind of but we did in fact have a show about the schedule. Yes.
Okay, so we talk about quarter polls, right? You break the season into quarters. There's 12 games. It's easy math, right? The first quarter, I love the first quarter for Notre Dame. Okay, they're not pushover games per se, but they're winnable games. They're games that allows Notre Dame to kind of get their feet underneath them on both offense and defense. I mean, we've talked about, the questions that we've got going into the season. There's questions on both sides of the ball. So the first three games are an opportunity for Notre Dame to kind of, get things moving in the right direction and
learn a lot about themselves.
100%, absolutely. And coaches, there's new coaches, there's new players and new roles, all of that. And so, you get through the first three games, and now you're getting into quarter two, game number 4. And I think this is where the rubber meets the road, right? I mean, everybody's kind of got this Wisconsin game circled. Obviously, it's a big game. It's going to be in Chicago. Wisconsin arguably is the best team on Notre Dame's schedule. I mean, this is a very important stretch that starts off with a very important opponent. And so these first three games, we're going to learn a lot about Notre Dame. We're going to see kind of where they're at and who they are. And I'm hoping that kind of not necessarily firing on all cylinders when you get to Wisconsin, but you better be firing on most because, Wisconsin is coming in for blood. They want to win this game just as much as Notre Dame does. This is a defining game for Wisconsin. No question about it based on their schedule. So it's a big game for both clubs, and Notre Dame has an opportunity leading up into this game to kind of get things where they need them to be going into game 4.
Yeah, and I really think the first three games, Vince, are it's the ideal start for me,
right?
Because there's not that opponents that's just so bad that you really don't learn a lot about yourself. Like Notre Dame, if you go back and watch the New Mexico game, especially offensively, Notre Dame did not play well that game.
Yeah,
but New Mexico was so bad that it didn't matter. You still scored over 60 points. So you didn't really learn a lot about yourself. And honestly, it didn't help you, in my opinion, kind of get ready for your next opponents. The three opponents that Notre Dame is going to face, Notre Dame's better than all of them. Notre Dame should beat all three of them.
Yes.
But they're at least good enough to where you can learn a little something. And each team
Right.
brings something different. Florida State has some athletes that you have to deal with. And then, their defensive line's good enough to kind of give the Notre Dame O-line an early test. When you look at Toledo, they don't have the talent of other teams, but, they're really well coached. They get after it. They're going to run some gimmicky stuff that is going to force you to be disciplined and execution, assignment sound and things that you can evaluate. Then you play Purdue and incredibly well schemed offensively, really good offensive talent in spots, really good DN you have to deal with. So again, is it a team that Notre Dame should beat? Yes. Is it a team that Notre Dame should beat somewhat soundly? Yes. But they have some things that can test you. And so if Notre Dame's 3-0 with 3 blowouts, that means they're playing really, really good football. If they're struggling a little bit, then that may actually be a good thing, because those teams are good enough to kind of point out something, to expose some of the flaws you have that you can then work on as you get ready for this stretch of 2 games. So that's why I love the way that this schedule's put together. And I don't know if they planned it that way, because who knew that Purdue was going to be what Purdue is, or
sure,
Florida State was going to be what Florida State is. It's just more of it's how it's worked out. It's really the ideal early season schedule for me.
Yes, no doubt. So let's jump into our preview of the Wisconsin Badgers. This will be game 3 for Wisconsin. This is game 4 for Notre Dame. Leading up to this game, Wisconsin has 2 home games that they host Penn State in the opener, which really, that's a big opener. I mean,
Big Ten has some really interesting season openers. Ohio State plays Minnesota to begin the season. Like they're some of these teams are jumping right into conference play. Michigan State plays Northwestern. Right. Nebraska plays Illinois. Ohio State plays at Minnesota. Iowa hosts Indiana. I mean, so you're seeing a lot of these Big Ten teams just week 1, not all of them, but just week 1, just diving right into conference play with some very interesting matchups. And that Wisconsin-Penn State one is going to be one of the better opening week games. And let me rephrase, maybe it's better to say intriguing opening week games, because both of those teams are coming off really weird years because of COVID and all that. We don't really know what either one of those teams are going to be.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be a really fascinating game. And then that second game, Vince, it's kind of like what we talked about with Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
5 years ago, you play Eastern Michigan, you're like, that's a warm-up game. Well, Eastern Michigan struggled a bit last year. Again, weird COVID year. But they were a bowl team the year before. In 2016, they were a bowl team the year before that. 2019, they made a bowl game. They only lost to Pitt by 4 points.
Yeah.
So again, are they a team that should beat Wisconsin? No. Are they going to be a team that, Wisconsin's really got to play their A game? No. But Wisconsin has an early season schedule, much like Notre Dame's when it comes to, Penn State's a little bit different. But that Eastern Michigan game, that's a game they're going to learn something about themselves. So it's also good for Notre Dame, Vince, because Notre Dame is now going to see some of their so Notre Dame may have some of their weaknesses exposed by their opponents. Well, Penn State and Eastern Michigan are clearly going to expose some of Wisconsin's weaknesses, which is going to give they're going to have to show all they've got in the opener.
Right.
Notre Dame doesn't necessarily have to do that in any of their games. We're going to see a lot of because if Wisconsin's going to have to struggle to win that game, period. And I know it's at home, but it's still that's going to be a tough battle. So we're going to learn a lot about Wisconsin. And then, of course, then they have a bye week before they play Notre Dame.
And that's everybody. And can we address that real quick? Everybody always gets their, they always, every team's got a bye week before they play Notre Dame, all this. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter, especially early on in the season. I mean, I like where Notre Dame's bye week is placed better than where Wisconsin's bye week is placed, frankly. And, okay, so they've got an extra week to prepare for Notre Dame. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't look at it the way some people look at it. I don't see it being a benefit. I don't see it being a negative. It's right down the middle for me as far as having a bye week before the Notre Dame game. Doesn't mean anything. Frankly, early on in the season, for me, I'd rather be playing. I would rather have 3 games under my belt than 2 going into this game.
Week 3 is not when I'd want to have a bye.
Exactly.
Because you're just kind of starting to learn about your team.
Yes.
I would have much rather had that third game to play another MAC team or somebody to say, hey, look, go play a mid-level Power 5 Vanderbilt or something. I would, because again, Wisconsin's a team that returns 15 starters. They They've got a lot of guys that played last year, maybe weren't starters, but played a lot that are coming back. But they're a team that also struggled last year. You went 4-3. Honestly, got outplayed by Wake Forest in a lot of different areas. I mean, Wake Forest moved the ball up and down the field on them, but they had 4 picks and they had a punt block that set up a Wisconsin touchdown. Wisconsin won by 14, but like they didn't play great that game if you watch that game. And so Wisconsin still got a lot to learn about itself. If I was them, I'd much rather play. But just I've always felt, Vince, bye weeks are really good for a team in situations like when Notre Dame's bye is this week or this year, where it's midterms and all that.
Exactly.
Or you just kind of get lucky that your bye week comes during a time when your team is really banged up.
Right.
And it gives you a week to kind of rest and relax, which is why I've always preferred bye weeks to kind of be in the middle towards the end of your season.
Yep.
I would not
you
like
can't
having a bye
predict
week
injuries, obviously, but yeah, early on.
But late in the season, you can at least know we're going to be banged up.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't care if you don't have any injuries, you're going to at least be banged up. Whereas in the third game of the year, like if you've got injury problems, third week of the year, it's been a rough start for you.
Right. And I feel like week 3, week 4 is like really when you're just starting to get your mojo working. You know what I mean? You're starting to answer some of the questions, that we have going into the season, that the coaches have, that the players have, all of that. It takes a few weeks to get that. And I feel like, you get 2 games in and now you got to take a break. And it's like you kind of lose that momentum, actually. And so I do not think that this bye is a good thing for Wisconsin going into the Notre Dame game. So I just wanted to kind of cover that before we kind of jumped into who Wisconsin is. I don't like the bye week for Wisconsin there. I really don't.
Yeah.
But, we'll see. Yeah. Again, is that going to hurt them necessarily? Probably not.
No, we're not saying it's going to necessarily hurt Wisconsin. We're just there's just this constant thing where every year, like last year was the same thing.
Yes.
Every ACC team Notre Dame plays has a bye week before they play Notre Dame. Well, how'd that work out for all those ACC teams?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It didn't matter. Notre Dame still won and won convincingly in a lot. And even when Notre Dame didn't play well, they still won.
Right.
Those things aren't needle movers to me. They're really not. And it's more about, especially I think the point you made, Vince, too, is just, especially early in the year, you want to play. You want to keep, unless you're a team that's just like super veteran, you already know who you are. Maybe you come into the year where you've got a couple guys that are banged up or something like that. But 9 times out of 10, you want to keep playing. That's really the thing you're looking for. And I think this Wisconsin team too, Vince, is the way that they play on offense. And we'll get into specifically who they are, but I really feel like they need as much continuity as possible. It's very much with what they do, everybody's got to be on the same page and all those kind of things. But Wisconsin, kind of big picture, Vince, this is an interesting team because they're getting a lot of, what are they, the one team that Notre Dame was favored to lose to? Are they still favored to lose that game? Has that changed, Vince?
You know what? I haven't looked recently. And I don't have my phone in front of me to look that up, so I apologize.
That's all right.
1.5 points the last time I looked, and that was probably a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. I'm sure I'll keep my eye over here on the comments. I'm sure somebody can find out that information for us.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting Wisconsin program because they've had a weird 5 years, in my opinion. They've been kind of up and down. They had a couple really good. You go back and you kind of look at when Paul Chryst arrived. They really got rolling early. They had I'm looking at now, went 11-3. Beat Western Michigan in the Cotton Bowl. The next year they go 13-1 with their only loss being to Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. But then that year you look at it and you say, okay, they beat a down Michigan team. Their next best win was like a home win over Northwestern. Like their out of conference was Utah State, Florida Atlantic, and BYU. It was a BYU team that went 4-9.
Yeah.
They didn't play. They played, like I said, Michigan was down. They didn't play Penn State that year. That was a year where Michigan State was really good. Remember that in the East, they didn't play Michigan State. The Michigan team they beat went 8-5, and remember that was a Michigan team that finished that year 4-5. If you remember that, lost to South Carolina in a bowl game.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a great Wisconsin team. Then they go out in 2018. They're 8-5. A little bit of a down year for them. Lost to BYU, if you remember that. Got spanked at Michigan, like really spanked, and that was a 7-6 BYU team they lost to. And they weren't very good. Especially offensively. Then in 2019, Jack Cohn takes over quarterback. They make a 5-point jump on offense, go 10-2 in the regular season, lose to Illinois though, which was weird. They spank Michigan. They beat number 10 Minnesota on the road, and then lose to terrible Illinois at home, on the road. It was just a weird year. Had a really tough loss at Oregon, and then last year they come out, and it's hard to really know who they are because of COVID. I mean,
they had 2 games canceled last year.
Yeah,
they went 500, and they needed that win in the bowl game to get to 500. I mean, they ended up being 3-3, but they beat Wake Forest. In the bowl game,
who wasn't very good.
I mean, that doesn't. Yeah, that's not a needle mover for me.
Everybody got a lot of excitement about. Remember how much hype there was about Wisconsin early in the year when they pounded Michigan?
Oh, 49-11. I mean, I watched the highlights of that game this morning, and they beat the snot out of Michigan, no question. But Michigan.
Then we find out that Michigan sucked, right?
Exactly.
I mean, then they go lose to Northwestern. The next 3 games, really the next 4 games, their offense was pretty terrible.
Right. They only scored up 7, 6.
Yeah, they scored 45 in the opener against Illinois, then 49 against Michigan. Then over the next 4 games, they scored a combined 40 points.
Yep. Exactly. Good math, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was slowly doing the math in my head. So over the next 4 games, carry the one, so they really struggled offensively over that period of time. And then you look at, they scored 42 points in the bowl game. They got on track. Nope. They had 266 yards of offense, 4.2 yards per play. They blocked a punt that gave them the ball like the 8-yard line, something like that. The Wake Forest quarterback drops back, throws a little swing pass to the running back, doesn't even see the linebacker standing right there. Noah Burks picks it off, runs it back. I don't think he scored, but they got him like in the red zone. They didn't move the ball well. They didn't play the ball. They didn't play well at all in that game. So it was a very misleading performance. It was actually their second lowest yards per game total yards in a game of the year, and second lowest yards per play of the year. They just benefited by the fact that Wisconsin or Wake Forest was just handing them the football. I mean, some of those interceptions they had in that game were just like, what are you doing, dude?
Yeah, right.
And then they had the block punt. So they really never got any momentum last year. Whereas, like, you look at Penn State, for example, right? Penn State was pretty terrible last year for a stretch of the season. I mean, I think Penn State started, 0-5? I'm looking at it. 0-5. Lost to Indiana, lost to Ohio State, got spanked by Maryland, lost to Nebraska, and then got killed by Iowa. And you're thinking this team's going to fold. Well, then they come out and they beat Michigan on the road. They beat Rutgers on the road. They beat Michigan State, beat Illinois, both in impressive fashion. Mm-hmm. So you kind of felt like, okay, Penn State had their struggles, but they went into the offseason with some momentum. I don't know if I would say that about Wisconsin because they didn't play well in either one of their wins. Minnesota was pretty bad last year, too.
And they won in overtime by a field goal.
Right. And Minnesota was not good last year.
Right.
So I don't know if we know a lot about this football team, Vince.
Right.
I really don't. And it makes it even more surprising that they're getting so much of the hype.
Bingo.
Because
nailed it.
A lot of the guys that were part of that Rose Bowl team are gone. All the offensive linemen are gone. Jonathan Taylor's gone. Jack Cohn's gone. And so I'm just still trying to figure out, is Wisconsin a good football team? Yes. Do I have Wisconsin as probably the toughest game on the schedule? Yes.
Yeah.
That's debatable. It's very debatable.
Sure.
And there's reasons for it. The reasons I have it is, Vince, is number one, it's away from home.
Right.
Number two, I think Wisconsin has they do certain things we'll get into defensively, and then their physicality up front, their size kind of concerns me a little bit about matching up against Notre Dame and an undersized front seven. So there are some things, but it's also about how I just don't think there's any great teams on Notre Dame's schedule, which I've said all summer. Notre Dame's schedule is challenging from the standpoint of there's 7 or 8 quality teams on it. There's no great team on it. There's no Wisconsin from last year. There's no Georgia from 2019. There's no Michigan from 2018 even. And so saying that they're the best team on the schedule doesn't mean that I think they should be getting the hype that they're getting.
Right.
I don't quite get that one.
Well, and it's the best team on the schedule for me because of the matchups.
Yes, what I say is it's the toughest matchup. They're not the best team.
They're okay, and that's fair. It's a different terminology of what I was using, but the same reasoning, right? I think this could be Notre Dame's toughest game, but if Notre Dame plays the way I believe that they can play, and if they come out quickly, and we'll get into all this, I don't know that it's going to be that close. I don't want to get people excited. I don't want people to think I'm a homer. That's not what I'm saying at all. And like I
It's
said,
too late.
my tune may completely change after we watch the first 3 games for Notre Dame.
Right.
I mean, it might.
That's what's fun about doing these previews this time of
Yeah,
year. Because everyone's still kind of a
different.
blank slate to a degree.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what kind of film am I watching to talk about Wisconsin? It's last year. We're watching last year's film, right? And that's what I was doing all morning. And there's certain things that scare me about this team going up against Notre Dame, but at the same time, I don't 100% know what Notre Dame brings to the table against Wisconsin. So, again, we're speculating obviously a lot doing this on August 5th. Come whatever the date is when they're playing Wisconsin, that upcoming week, when we start talking about Wisconsin and what they've done in their first 2 games, and we know what Notre Dame done in their first 3 games, we're going to have a lot better idea of the way this game's going to play out.
And I want to bring up a comment that was made, because we're going to do this. It's a little bit different than we normally do, because it gets into where I feel like the perception of Notre Dame is based on their past in a negative way. The perception of Wisconsin is based on their past in a positive way.
Yes, and
here's
think that's
a perfect
huge.
example.
You got a good one.
Nicholas Grosh. Although we run different schemes and we probably have better talent, I think Notre Dame and the Badgers have kind of similar records for the last few years. I'm worried unless we click on all cylinders. Wisconsin the last 3 years is 22-12.
Right.
Notre Dame is 33-5. Their records aren't anywhere close the last few years, but the perception is different. Look, Wisconsin's gone 8-5, 10-4, and 4-3. Notre Dame has gone 12-1, 11-2, and 10-2. Notre Dame's losses have been to what? Bama, Clemson, Georgia, and Michigan. The Michigan one being the exception of that was a bad loss.
Absolutely. It does. They don't belong in the same echelon as those other teams. No, absolutely.
Right. Yes. Wisconsin's lost to some good teams. They lost to a really good Oregon team in 2019. They've lost a few games to Ohio State, but they've also lost games to some teams that aren't very good. If we're going to, Illinois. I mean, that was an Illinois team that stunk. If we're going to be honest,
Illinois is good. Sorry.
Right. That was a 6-7 Illinois team. I forgot. I didn't realize Illinois made a bowl game that year.
Wow.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. Still stunk. They wouldn't have made a bowl game if they lost to Wisconsin. Last year, they lost to Wisconsin lost to Northwestern, Indiana at home, Iowa, and convincing. They've been blown out by Iowa a couple times. Obviously, lost to Ohio State and Oregon, and then 2018 they lost to a 4-9 BYU team. They lost 38-13 to Michigan, so they've got their own Michigan blowout on their schedule. A year that which Notre Dame beat Michigan. They lost by 2, so they got 2 losses at Northwestern. They lost by 2 touchdowns at Northwestern in 2018. Remember, that's a Northwestern team that Notre Dame went to Northwestern and beat them by 10. They lost to Penn State by 12, and Minnesota beat them 37-15 at Wisconsin. So, no, these 2 teams have not been close the last 3 years. But, again, I'm not hammering Nicholas because I think that's a perception that a lot of people have.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why Notre Dame's an underdog in this game.
Right.
Because I think it's all about perception. It's not about – and that's why that line is going to move. I'm sorry. Right. Once we get to the week of the game and there's been 5 games played between the 2 teams, that line's moving. I'm sorry. That line – if it stays that way, there's going to be a lot of Notre Dame fans that are going to win a lot of money. And that's just a fact. So – we'll see how it goes. And again, I haven't looked at the line in a couple of weeks. And it may have changed. Right now, it was 1.5 that Notre Dame was a dog by. And I didn't see it then. I don't see it now. But I almost guarantee you that line's going to move. It has to, unless Vegas wants to get fleeced.
I don't see it. I don't get the perception. And I think one of the things that we get feedback a lot of is that people say, hey, we're going to call it how we see it. Doesn't mean we're always going to be right.
Correct.
This is one that I'm looking at and I'm saying, look, like you said, we're not homers here. I don't get it. I really don't. Like, okay, to prove it, I think USC is going to be a lot tougher game than a lot of people think it is. Well, USC was 5-7 the year that Notre Dame went 12-0, and Notre Dame struggled in that game. In 2019, that was not a very good USC team. Notre Dame won by a touchdown, right? Rivalry games and all that other stuff. So I think there's some teams that are going to be better than people think. This Wisconsin team is not one that I think is going to be as good. Now, let's dive into the specific matchup, because after saying all that, that's our conversation of Wisconsin as a team.
Right.
There's a reason that I have Wisconsin as the toughest matchup for Notre Dame. So we're kind of talking out of both sides of our mouth.
Right.
I don't think this is going to be a great Wisconsin team as I look at their schedule between Penn State, Notre Dame on a neutral field, Michigan at home, at Illinois, at Purdue, home against Iowa, home against Nebraska, at Minnesota. Not a tough schedule. I still see them losing 2-3 games.
Oh, yeah.
Against that schedule.
So.
I have them go 9-3 this year.
Okay.
So just, but again, no Ohio State, no, Penn State at home, Michigan at home, Notre Dame on a neutral field. The schedule sets up pretty nicely for them.
9-3 for Wisconsin, though, is pretty good year for them based on the last few years.
Based on the last few, yeah. I mean, they went 10-2 in 2019, but the quarterback that led them to 10-2 is playing for Notre Dame now.
Right, exactly.
So in the years where he wasn't starting, they went 4-3 and 8-5. So I think they're going to still be a good team, and I think part of the reason that I look at it and say this is going to be a tough matchup for Notre Dame is because style of play and personnel matchups go into what makes a tough game. You can see one team just struggles. Like, there's been teams like at times where Alabama will struggle with the team. Like, why do they keep struggling with that team? Clemson and Syracuse is a perfect example.
Yeah.
Syracuse stinks. Clemson lost to Syracuse one year and twice we're talking about in this last 4 years where they've made the playoff every year. They lost to Syracuse one year, almost lost to Syracuse in 2018, and then this past year we're losing in the second half to Syracuse. It's just sometimes you just have that weird matchup where a team gives you problems, and you can you explore and say, okay, here's why they do things or whatever the case may be. So when I look at this Wisconsin team, the first thing that concerns me, Vince, when I look at them is the fact that Notre Dame has not been a great rushing defense, especially against big physical teams. And part of the reason Notre Dame has not been a great matchup in these games is because Notre Dame doesn't have great size. And you look at what Notre Dame does, Jason Adamiel is 285. Kurt Hinish is listed at 295, but you and I both know he's not that big. He's not a big guy. He's not a space mover, space eater. You look at their event, they should have some good size there, but you look at this Wisconsin offensive line, they returned 4 starters from last year.
Right.
They're 312, 322, 323, 297, and 319. They have pretty good size up front. And then they play this really reduced type of offense, right? So their offense is kind of a lot like what we saw from Notre Dame last year. A lot of 12 personnel, a lot of twin formations with 2 tights to the side, moving the tight ends
on that offensive line, right? I mean, they're going to be an offensive line focused team, which means they're going to try to run the ball. Now, biggest question marks are the running backs, but they're going to try to run the ball, play action, a lot of that kind of stuff.
And they're going to do things within the run game. They're very big into numbers and leverage.
Yes.
And what that means is they're very big into saying, "Oh, we're going to try to get a numbers advantage to a side of the line." So you'll see them do things where they'll actually have the tight end backside lined up as a tackle. They'll take their tackle and put them over with another tight end. So they're going to try to get numbers, and they're going to try to get leverage on you to set up angles for blocks. They're really good about that, and they'll use motions and shifts and all types of things to try to get you moving, and then you're mid-move, and they're snapping the ball, and they're coming right at you, and they're trying to move you off the line of scrimmage.
Yep.
That's a lot about what Wisconsin is. That would not concern me if they're playing some teams. That concerns me a little bit about Notre Dame simply because this is not a real big Notre Dame front seven. If there's a weakness about this defense, it's that right there. This is not real big. You look at, like we talked about the D tackles, Jacob Lacey, I've been told, is down into the 270s now. Howard Cross is in the 270s. Riley Mills is in the 270s. There's not a lot of size. I mean, right now, if you look at the 2 deep, Jason Adamiel at 285 is their second biggest defensive tackle. They got good size on the defensive end position, but then their middle linebacker, 6 foot 225. If Marist ends up winning it, starting at the will position, he's 6'3", 215, 220. Jack Kaiser's not real big. So this is not a big Notre Dame front seven.
Sure.
That is the one matchup that I would say personnel-wise, Notre Dame's got better players than Wisconsin does. But that's the matchup where could that be a bit of a neutralizer? And then what is Marcus Freeman going to do to overcome that? Now, we have a little bit of a glimpse of that, and it was the Sugar Bowl.
The Georgia game.
Against Georgia.
Yes. And I
because we saw him go to play big boy football. They did a lot when every time Georgia substituted to go 12 personnel, one running back, 2 tight ends, Cincinnati substituted to a 4-3 personnel every time. And so we saw them handle Georgia's run game.
Yeah.
And that was a big physical line, and Cincinnati has very similar issues to what Notre Dame has, although their linebackers are bigger than what Notre Dame's are. And so we've seen Marcus Freeman do that, but how's he going to handle that with Notre Dame's personnel? We don't know the answer to that yet. What hurt them against Georgia was Georgia could spread it out, could take those one-on-one shots, right? JT Daniels could drop back and throw the ball down the field. I don't know if Wisconsin's going to be able to do that to Notre Dame. That's the difference.
Because of their personnel.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. Like Georgia's personnel, they had 5 stud top talent, and they had a great talent at quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And they could win. Then they didn't win a bunch of them, but they won like 4 or 5. It reminded me a lot of the Clemson Notre Dame game in 2018, where Cincinnati just shut Georgia down a lot. But then you look at the end of the game and you're like, wow, Georgia threw for a lot of yards. I don't really remember them completing that many passes.
It's big plays.
Yes, because they had a ton of big plays in that game. They passed for 404 yards in that game. And JT Daniels completed 27 passes, and I'm like, I don't remember them. But then you go back and you're, 50 yards there. I mean, like 200 yards on 5 completions.
Right, exactly. And Cincinnati took away Georgia's run in the first half. I mean, that's why they were up the way they were.
Georgia only ran for like 40-some yards in the game.
I mean, they took away the run game in the first half, and they also put a lot of pressure on JT Daniels, and so he wasn't able to do some of the dink and dunk that Georgia likes to do offensively, right? And so that is what gives me, I don't want to say optimism because I'm optimistic regardless, but watching that game this morning gave me like, okay, like Georgia does pretty much what Wisconsin wants to do. They want to run the ball. They want to run some play action. Are they going to take some shots? Yes, but I like Notre Dame versus the guys that they're taking shots with on the outside. So I think the matchups are good in that regard. Now, here's where Notre Dame needs to be on point. They need to be on point with a little bit of misdirection blitzing, bringing pressure and things like that.
That's the thing that Wisconsin does better than Georgia is the movement, the pre-snap shifts. They'll shift 2 guys over, then bring one of them back, pause him, then send a receiver on a jet motion. I mean, they go super slow tempo. I mean, really slow tempo.
Yeah.
And their goal is to get you out leveraged or outnumbered.
And they'll do jet sweeps, they'll do end rounds. I mean, and to try to get their guys in motion.
And so that's part of who they are. It's not if you see them run reversing, it's Notre Dame, it's not a trick play. Right. I mean, it is, but it's not something that, we got to do this to beat Notre Dame. No, that's just that's what they do.
Who they are.
They just do that.
Because it's about leverage, like you said. It's about numbers. And if they feel like they can get somebody moving and outnumber Notre Dame on one side, they're going to do it.
And it's to try to keep you from playing too aggressively downhill against their run. Hey, you play too hard downhill, we're just going to bang this reverse on you. So I think that's the matchup in this game that concerns me from a Notre Dame defense standpoint is, what's Marcus Freeman's game plan going to be? Can the defensive line really play big boy football in this game? And can they limit the big plays in the pass game? That's the other interesting matchup. So I think Notre Dame should be able to handle this matchup. But when you look at Danny Davis and Kendrick Pryor and those kind of guys, they got a really good tight end and in Jake Ferguson. So there are some matchups where they shouldn't really punish Notre Dame in the pass game. But if Notre Dame's not on their P's and Q's, they can give up a big play or two. And that's the last thing you can do to Wisconsin. If they want a little dink and dunk you, fine, whatever.
Right.
You can't give up the big plays in the pass game.
And they will hammer that seam. I mean, they've got tight ends, and they are not afraid to throw them the ball.
And
I mean,
they have really creative play action pass concepts.
And we saw that when we were breaking down Jack Cohn's film 2 years ago, and I've seen it watching Graham Mertz. I mean, that's a system throw. That's not, specific to the quarterback. So they're not afraid to bang that seam to the tight end, because that's a size matchup that Wisconsin likes. You know what I mean? So you've got to be ready for that kind of stuff. You've got to be ready for the tight ends going down the field and things of that nature.
And here's the other thing too. They're going to be much more of a big play pass game this year.
Yes.
Because of Graham Mertz.
Yeah.
Graham Mertz really struggled last year, but he didn't necessarily go into the season expected to be the starter. He was competing, but when Jack Cohn got hurt, he was kind of thrust into the starting role. And he struggled. I mean, if we're being honest, but again, he struggled partly because I would expect a redshirt freshman to struggle under those circumstances.
Sure.
Hey, we're not playing this year. Okay. Well, now we are playing.
Now you are playing.
Oh, the starting quarterback just hurt his foot. Okay. And then he comes out and he goes 20 of 21 against Illinois. completed 95.2% of passes, and the hype machine exploded.
Oh, of course it did.
And then, of course, he didn't play great against Michigan. He went 12 of 22, but now all of a sudden he's 7 touchdown passes in 2 games, and they're 2-0. They're scoring 4, and the hype train just went off. And then, next week against Northwestern, he throws 1 pick or throws 3 picks, 1 touchdown, goes 23 of 41. He doesn't complete 60% of his passes over a 4-game stretch. Got picked off 5 times in 6 games or 7 games, and just really didn't play great, if we're being honest. And if you take out that 190, he's completed 61.1% of his passes in 7 games. And one of those games he had 95.2%.
You take that out and that number drops significantly.
Right. 8%. And he was still 8.5 percentage points lower than what Jack Cohn was the year before.
In 12 games.
14 games.
14, excuse me.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, but those struggles last year are going to benefit Graham Mertz this year because he's seen it. He's been in those weird situations. If he can mentally handle last year, this normal offseason is going to be fine for him. He's got to stay healthy, obviously, but he's got a big arm. He's a good athlete. And to me, he's a future NFL quarterback. If they, with any young quarterback, figure out the mental stuff. Can you read a defense? All those kind of typical young quarterback things. But he's going to have one of the best arms that Notre Dame is going to face this year. Let's not forget, Chip Long and Tommy Rees worked hard to try to flip him from Wisconsin when he was coming out of high school. He's in the same recruiting class as Brendan Clark. Notre Dame went to Brendan Clark after they realized they weren't going to get Graham Mertz.
Right.
And Graham Mertz was part of the reason that Cade McNamara decommitted from Notre Dame because, honestly, that's the guy that they wanted. They wanted Graham Mertz. He was their guy. So this is a very talented quarterback. Yeah. The biggest concern I have is that Notre Dame has to commit extra resources to stop the run because of the size issue.
And then Graham Mertz can hurt you. Yeah,
with the big plays
right
down the field. That's my concern.
No, absolutely. And I'm hoping Notre Dame's talent, I'm hoping the scheme allows them to not have to dedicate more people to the box and they can continue to play their game. You know what I mean? And I haven't seen Marcus Freeman coach a game at Notre Dame. Okay, that's the asked and answered part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I still feel like he is going to be able to scheme his way to allow Notre Dame to continue to play the way they need to play.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? They have the athletes, they have speed, and when you add the scheme that Marcus Freeman I think is going to bring to the table against Wisconsin, I think they're going to be okay. But I echo your point. If Notre Dame is struggling and they need to devote more to the box, that's when they can get in trouble against this team. I mean, that's clearly where the problem is going to be. And I think one thing going for Notre Dame right now is there's not a lot of experience in the Wisconsin backfield, but with the experience coming back at offensive line and at quarterback, I'm not sure that even matters that much.
Right.
Wisconsin's always going to bring in those 3-star running backs, and they're gonna produce.
Although Jalen Berger was actually a pretty highly ranked player out of Jersey. So he's a pretty good back. I don't know
why running backs wouldn't want to go to Wisconsin.
I don't get it either. I know one reason why. It's Wisconsin.
Well, fair enough. Look,
right. You think Notre Dame's this? I'm not taking a shot at Wisconsin, but if you think it's cold in Notre Dame in South Bend, try going a few hours north to where you're literally on Lake Michigan, and you're what I mean. Like it gets cold up there.
Yeah, you're right.
And I've heard Madison's heard it's a gorgeous campus. I've never been.
Neither have I.
It's not a shot at Wisconsin. I've heard Wisconsin's a beautiful state. I'm talking about just if you're from Florida, it's one thing to go to South Bend and where you're going to get to travel. Because here's the thing about Notre Dame. Hey, we travel to the ACC country. We travel out to California. We're not playing 12 games in the Midwest. Whereas in Wisconsin, guess what? Once you get past October, every game you play is going to be cold. Well, Notre Dame's flying out to LA or San Francisco for the last game of the year. They're flying down to the Carolinas in October, down to Virginia. So I think that's one of the reasons why. But yeah, if I'm a running back, so what? So what happens if you get drafted by an NFC or an AFC North team, right?
Exactly. Suck it up.
I'm going to Wisconsin and running for 1,000,000 yards.
Exactly.
I think one thing that does concern some backs is the usage. You're going to carry the ball a lot. And people say there's a lot of tread on the tires. And Wisconsin backs haven't exactly turned out to be great NFL players. Melvin Gordon's been okay, but Monty Ball was awful. He was a huge bust. Jonathan Taylor had a good rookie year, but he didn't light the world on fire. He was good. I think he's projected to be better going into year 2.
Sure. Oh yeah,
from what I've read.
Yeah.
But I think those are the factors. But man, if you're a running back that says I want to carry the ball 20 times a game, I don't know if there's a better school for you to go to.
I want to throw a comment up here, Brian, from Ashley. He makes a good point. So he says, it feels like you were just saying how good the D-line depth is. This might be the best defense in the Brian Kelly era. Slump-proof, now doom and gloom to an offense that barely put up 21.
Nobody said anything about doom and gloom, Ashley.
It's a matchup.
We're trying to give you rational football explanations, and the reality is this is a matchup that is concerning for us.
Sure.
We just got done saying that Wisconsin is not as good as people say, but if you want us to give you honest analysis, then we have to say Notre Dame is a defensive line where 5 of their top 6 defensive tackles in the depth chart 4 of the top 6 defensive tackles on the depth chart weigh under 280 pounds against an offensive line that's got like 3 guys that weigh over 320 that is going to use 2 and 3 tight ends. If you look at where Notre Dame has struggled in recent years, it's been against teams that are big and physical and run the football.
Right.
And
I will also say, in our last preview, I said I was going to sound like a broken record that the Notre Dame defensive line are going to be a mismatch in a positive way against whatever offensive line they're going to be going after. This is the one game where I'm not saying that. This is the
one game because of the style of play.
Correct.
And this is the thing that people have to understand too. You have to understand, and we've seen a couple comments on it. I think it was our guy Ladarius, I think, said it. But football's a matchup game. And that's what we're talking about with, so I can sit there and tell you how great Clemson is, but every time I see Syracuse on Clemson's schedule, I'm like,
good luck.
That's going to be interesting. Why would I say something stupid like that? Syracuse beat Clemson in 2017, almost beat him in 2018. If it's not for the third string quarterback coming off the bench and rescuing them, they were losing to Syracuse in the second half of the 2020 season.
I remember that
with Trevor Lawrence a quarterback. It's just a weird matchup. For whatever reason, Syracuse just tends to give Clemson more problems than anybody else. It's weird. I can't get it. I can't explain it. But the fact of the matter is when you look at this matchup, this is a matchup where you look at Notre Dame's personnel, which we think is going to be very, very good. This is the one matchup that says, okay, I'm a little nervous about that, right? And that's how it is.
Ashley responds, you scared me.
With what?
Yeah, well, saying that I think Ashley thought you were coming across as saying this is a bad matchup for Notre Dame. I'm not saying that aspect of it, the size is the troubling matchup for Notre Dame. That doesn't mean Notre Dame's going to struggle there because there's things, because the flip side of it, if you'd let us actually finish the breakdown, the flip side of that, and here's why I don't get the hype about Wisconsin beating Notre Dame is the flip side of that is the one thing that Wisconsin's got to be looking at this game is saying, they're really fast. Exactly.
How are we going to handle the speed that?
And that's what can beat size. I mean,
correct.
Yes.
And but so that's where the chess match. And you were getting ready to get into this when you start talking about Marcus Freeman,
right?
Before I ask this question, that's what we're going to see. So if you're Marcus Freeman, you say, okay, I'm an idiot if I'm going to ask us to go play big boy football.
Correct.
Although I would use Aiden Keanaaina and Gabriel Rubio a little bit more in this game than I maybe would in other games.
And I might
that's your two biggest guys.
And I might use, Isaiah Pryor maybe a little bit more in this game just because he's kind of a thumper,
Or maybe this is the game that you see what we talked about last week is a little Bo Bauer and Drew White. But the point being,
right,
if you're Marcus Freeman, you'd be a fool to say we're going to just try to play big on big.
Yeah.
For 60 minutes because you're playing right into their hands.
Right.
His thing is, okay, how can we utilize our speed? Okay, yes, Jason Adamiola is outweighed by 30, 40 pounds by both of their guards. But you know what else? Neither one of those guys are in the same universe as him when it comes to speed and quickness and all that. So are we going to be afraid of their strength or are we going to play to ours, which is athleticism?
Right.
And which one's going to win? That's the question. And so when you've watched in recent years when Ohio State's had success against Wisconsin, shutting Wisconsin's run game down, it hasn't been every time. It's because they just penetrate. Can Notre Dame do that? That's going to be a question. And that's so okay. So Drew White can't physically just come on and take on guards all game. So what do? You run stun him. You let him use his speed to where those big old guards and those big old tackles are just getting out of their stance, and Drew White's running by him, or Maris Luafau's running by him, or Jason Adamiola is just shooting the A gap, and you're guys killing us, because here's the big thing about size, and this is what we're talking about. If I'm a 330-pound guard and I can keep my shoulders square on you or slightly turn where I'm double teaming you all game, I'm going to whip you. But the minute I got to turn my hips like this, I'm done.
It's game over.
Because my size is no longer an asset.
Correct.
Now it's about athleticism. And so can Marcus Freeman figure out ways to do that? There's a lot of different ways to do that. One is just let your guys penetrate. Mm-hmm. The other way is doing things where you're playing really quick line games where you're really slamming your linemen this way and then bringing your linebackers over top, using Kyle Hamilton as a weapon. Basically, hey, we're going to dare you to try to throw the ball downfield.
Right.
Because we think we got corners that can handle that. And so you bring Kyle Hamilton down in the box. Or you bring Houston Griffith down in the box and you dare them to throw the ball deep with Kyle Hamilton patrolling the middle of the field. There's all types of different ways they can do it. So that's going to be the chess match of this game. If this becomes big on big, Notre Dame's going to have trouble. They're going to run the clock. They're going to milk the clock. Notre Dame's offense is not going to be on the field, and Wisconsin's going to run on them. Look, other than first half of last year, when Notre Dame had some really good success against the run defense last year, run defense has not been a strength for Notre Dame for years. It hasn't. And you look at how last year ended for Notre Dame. They gave up over 200 yards against Syracuse, gave up over 200 yards against Clemson. Alabama only went for 140, but they averaged 5.6 yards a carry, right? You look at the year before, 281 to Navy, 303 to Michigan, 212 to New Mexico, 249 to Louisville. Year before that, 211 to Clemson in the playoff, 292 to Navy, 259 to Wake Forest. Heck, Ball State ran for 169 yards on Notre Dame the year that they went undefeated. So this has been an issue for Notre Dame at times.
Sure.
Now, what has been a benefit to Notre Dame is if you're one-dimensional, you're not gonna beat Notre Dame.
Right.
And that's where this is the game to me more than any other where the cornerbacks have to be good.
Yes.
And if the corners can go ahead, Vince.
Oh, I was going to say, if people need an example of what we're talking about here, I would tell people to go back and look at the 2018 Clemson game. Okay. And I'm saying here's what I mean by that. Clemson said to Notre Dame, we know you have a great run game, but we're going to stop your run. You're going to have to beat us through the air. So they put their assets, in the box.
That's what Alabama did to them this year too.
There you go.
I'd say that's even a greater example because
fair enough. Yeah.
But finish your thought on 2018 Clemson because I'm actually going to add to that because there's another way to look at that too.
So my thing was Clemson looked at their defense and said, look, our corners can handle the wide receivers that Notre Dame has, and we are not afraid of the quarterback throwing those guys open, right? We're just not afraid of that. And if you do it, then you tip your hat and you beat us. Right. And I think that's what, you're going to see Notre Dame if that's the route that they take. And I think they could, if Wisconsin can't get anything going in the pass game, you better show some respect to those corners to what they did, because that means they weren't open. And you're going to see corners on an island in that game, maybe more so than in the first three games. You're going to, see things of that nature because of what the front seven is up to and what they're doing. And maybe what Kyle Hamilton is doing closer to the line of scrimmage, et cetera. So to Brian's point, a lot of this is going to be on the Notre Dame secondary. This is going to be a big test for them. And I think this is going to be their first real test. And I'm not saying necessarily talent one-on-one, but the real test as to how these corners are going to affect the game plan for Notre Dame.
I think you used the right game, but the wrong matchup in 2018 Clemson.
Okay.
I think the better example for me, Vince, would have been what Notre Dame did to Clemson. Where Notre Dame said to, and for the matchup that we're discussing, what Notre Dame said to Clemson is, you're not going to run on us.
Yeah.
Right. You're not going to run the football on us, and you're going to have to beat us throwing the ball downfield. And for 28 minutes of the first quarter, Clemson couldn't do that. They scored 9 points. 3 of those points were set up because of Notre Dame, fumbling the football at midfield on a drive, and Clemson was only able to muster a field goal out of it. Then Clemson hit about 4 or 5 big plays. That's it. Clemson, if you think about that game, Clemson had like 5 good plays in that game on offense. That's it. And the result was 30 points because they were able to hit those big plays. And so to me, if you're Notre Dame, you're saying, hey, you're not going to run on us. We're going to beat you. We'll see your numbers and we'll raise you the box numbers, right?
Right.
You want to try to out leverage us. We're going to bring our rover down. We're going to bring our, you're not going to outnumber us, right? Well, then that leaves you in one-on-ones. If Notre Dame if Notre Dame's defense can play the way that Clemson's defense did against Notre Dame in 2018, sure. But if what happens against Wisconsin is kind of what happened against Notre Dame then you could see some problems. Here's the difference. Last I checked, let me check real quick. Yeah, I don't see Justin Ross or T. Higgins on here.
Yeah, right.
Let me see Hunter Renfrow. No Hunter Renfrow either. So, I mean, that's the thing where I look at and say that's the reason that Wisconsin at the end of the day is not a team that I think is going to beat Notre Dame, because they don't have the perimeter speed to make Notre Dame pay for loading the box.
Yep.
In my opinion. Now, the danger with loading the box is if you get out leveraged and you're loaded the box, it's gone. I mean, that's why Wisconsin knows they're going to face a loaded box. That's why they run the ball the way they run the ball with, counters and like, hey, you're going to overload to where they have 2 tight ends and an extra tackle, but then they're going to bring because this is what they'll do. They'll put an extra tackle in the game, right? Go 2 tight ends and an extra lineman on one side and then counter away from it. So you're loaded up to that side and then they run away from it. They're really smart in how they design their run game.
Sure.
You've got to win some one-on-one battles, but you've got to be able to figure out how do we match their numbers and leverage and not get exposed by it. And then after that, it's just can you win on the perimeter? And that's where I'm confident for Notre Dame in this matchup.
Right.
That's what at the end of the day has hurt Wisconsin all these years against Ohio State.
Yeah, nothing about Wisconsin's offensive perimeter game scares me. Now,
no.
Their quarterback's pretty good. Don't get me wrong. But you got to throw to some dudes, and those dudes have to get open. And I'm just not convinced that that's going to be the case. I'm more worried about what happens in the box. But as you just outlined, there's ways to combat what Wisconsin wants to do in the box.
Well, like you look at what Iowa did to them last year. Yeah. I mean, Iowa just beat them up front. Right. Held them to 56 yards. Well, the difference is Iowa's really big on defense. Notre Dame's not.
Yeah.
But you look at Ohio State in 2019, for example, Wisconsin ran for 83 yards in that first matchup, which was in the rain. They ran for 200 in the second matchup, but then in the second half, they really shut Wisconsin's run game down. And the same thing happened in 2017 when they played Ohio State. It was a close game. Wisconsin lost 27-21. They only ran for 60 yards. And at the end of the day, Wisconsin couldn't make enough plays in the pass game to win that game.
Right.
And to me, that's going to be the key. Is if your secondary can keep Wisconsin from ripping off those big plays, then I just don't think Wisconsin can do enough offensively to really stay in this game. Not win this game, but not stay in this game. Just from that matchup. Then we get into the other matchup. And this is the one that, based on what we know of Notre Dame, concerns me.
Sure.
But if Notre Dame does what I think they're capable of, this could be a rout.
And this is where our preview will differ the most from August 5th to the week leading up to Game 4. You know what I mean?
Like, we're going to know so much more about Notre Dame.
Well, I really don't think
I hope it doesn't differ.
Well,
but it could differ.
Here's what I mean by that, though. What I'm saying is I don't think our analysis of Notre Dame's defense versus Wisconsin's offense is going to change a whole lot in that preview. Where I believe things are going to change a little bit is this upcoming preview when we're talking about Notre Dame's offense versus Wisconsin's defense, right? Mm-hmm. Because I really do believe if Notre Dame goes into it with the same game plan that they went into 2020, this could be a long night for Notre Dame offensively. It really could. It really could, because you're going to take your perceived strength, and last year it was the offensive line, the run game, etc., and you're going to go right up against Wisconsin's strength, which is just corn-fed meat right up the middle, right? I mean, and
just to give you a little perspective, they're a 3-4 team,
right?
Their 3 defensive linemen are 313. That's Keanu Benton. Matt Henningsen is 292, and their small guy 292. Their other defensive ends 295. So their 3 starting defensive linemen are all bigger than Notre Dame's biggest defensive linemen.
Right.
I mean, again, that's what we're talking about.
Size-wise, yeah. And they return all 4 of their linebackers. I mean, it's meat.
But see, you know what, Vince? That's not the part of Wisconsin that concerns me.
Yeah.
It really isn't. If Wisconsin just plays straight up against Notre Dame, I'm not worried about it. I'm not. But they're not. That's not who they are. They don't just play straight up. They're like, there's this perception that I think you've seen them play. But there's this perception that people have when I talk to people about Wisconsin who really haven't really watched or paid attention. They'll watch a game, but they're not really studying it.
Right.
And they're a 3-4 team. Okay. But they're in their mind, they view it as like the Bob Diaco 3-4, just these big physical guys that just line up and we play disciplined football. No, they move all over the place. They're going to bring run stunts and blitzes and just twists and stunts because they know they're not good enough to just line up against a team like Notre Dame and play big boy football. And
that's the benefit of having 4 linebackers. Right. You can kind of bring them from all areas, Right.
And Jim Leonard's a former NFL guy, played in the NFL for a long time. He does some really exotic stuff. And the good news is that if your offensive line is good enough to pick all that stuff up, you can move the ball on them. The concern for me is for most of Jeff Quinn's tenure, that's been a problem. Handling those line games, especially from teams that play 3 down fronts, handling those twists and stunts and slants and those exotic pressures. They even struggle with that against like Ball State. Teams like that have given them problems in the past. That makes me real nervous when I look at this because Jim Leonard's going to be one of the most creative defensive coordinators Notre Dame's going to face all year. If they can pick that stuff up, Notre Dame's going to rip Wisconsin apart. But if they're struggling with those line games, it's going to be a slugfest. It's going to be a low scoring game. Notre Dame's going to do a lot of punting, and their defense is going to have to get them some points by short fields or turning the ball, forcing turnovers or something like that. But because the same thing that we talked about on defense is true on offense. Wisconsin's got really good big guys. Their linebackers are smart. They're physical. They're instinctive. But they're not super athletes.
Yeah, they're good sized because they're big.
Right.
240, 245, 235, 267.
6'2", 245, 6'2", 235, 6'2", 257, 6'2", 228 pound sophomore.
Yeah, big boys.
But the reality is they just can't match up athletically with Notre Dame. But if your line gets beat, then it negates. It's like exactly what we just talked about on the other side of the ball. If Notre Dame can take away their size, but then they got to limit the skill on the perimeter.
Right.
And if Notre Dame can do that, Notre Dame's going to be successful. Well, the same thing is true here. If the Notre Dame offense can make this a speed-on-speed game, they're going to dominate Wisconsin.
Right.
But that gets negated if you're not able to protect your quarterback. That gets negated if you're giving up pressures and giving up tackles for loss where you're getting off schedule. You're in 2nd and 12 or 3rd and 9 and things like that. Then you get in trouble because he's going to bring some exotic pressures. But skill-wise, we saw this against Wake Forest. Wisconsin didn't get great pressure on Wake Forest consistently, at least early in that game, and Wake Forest just picked them apart.
Yeah.
And was able to get guys in space and isolations and just they just outran the Wisconsin secondary for 60 minutes. Right. And if it wasn't for think about it. Wisconsin had over 500, or Wake Forest, had over 500 yards of offense. For 500 yards of offense,
They
scored 28 points.
Yeah,
because they had a blocked punt and they had 6 yards per play. But what was the problem? They kept turning the ball over. That's what hurt them. And that's to me where Notre Dame's got to be. Notre Dame's got to be in that world of we're going to attack. We're going to make it a speed-on-speed game. We're going to protect. We're going to take some shots, but we're going to get the ball on the perimeter, and we're going to hurt you. That's what Wisconsin did to Ohio State, or Ohio State did to Wisconsin 2 years ago when they played them in the Big Ten championship game. Remember, Wisconsin was winning in that game at halftime, and they were beating Ohio State up front. But in the second half, Ryan Day made some changes. He made it a speed-on-speed game, and Wisconsin didn't have a chance.
Yeah.
And that's what Tommy Rees and this staff are going to have to do from the beginning.
Yes,
is make this a speed on speed, our perimeter against your perimeter, and go with it. And if they can do that, then I don't think this is going to be an overly competitive game. And just to give you a heads up, Wisconsin in 2019 going into that game was beating Ohio State 21-7 at halftime. And Ohio State scored 27 points 27 unanswered points in the second half, because again they made it a perimeter ball game, and that's what Notre Dame is going to have to do
Yeah.
in this game.
Well,
Just make
and
it
this
a
is
perimeter ball game.
and this is why I'm saying this is where my analysis might change the most, because right now, do I feel like they can do that? I feel like they could do that, but I still need to see them do that a little bit in the first 3 games to really feel confident that that game plan is going to be successful. You know what I mean? And that's where I sit. You know, do I think that Notre Dame can do that? Yeah. And this is another game where we talked about a couple of weeks ago, I want to say, where Notre Dame can use tempo. Like, I really feel like tempo in this game could really benefit Notre Dame. I really do, because
Can you explain why? Because we'll see if I agree with you, but let's explain to them why tempo.
Well, I think that number one, you're not going to allow them to get settled in what they want to do, because if they're going to be as effective defensively as they need to be, and I'm talking about Wisconsin, they need to do some line games, and they need to be doing some different things, and they need to be moving around. But if you don't give them that opportunity, that just benefits the offense. Right. That benefits Notre Dame. And so if you move them in a little bit of tempo, that takes them out of what they want to do. Plus, you're also allowing your speed guys to continue to be speedy while Wisconsin's doing too much thinking and trying to get settled. And so that's where I think tempo can really be beneficial in this game.
I just want to make a reminder, this is a Notre Dame podcast, not an Alabama podcast. So maybe we could talk about Notre Dame in the chat a little bit instead of Alabama. So I'd appreciate that. So Vince, you get down to it. Ultimately, I don't see this being a competitive game, to be completely honest with you. And again, that's partly because I do have, maybe it's an unwarranted or an optimism that hasn't been earned yet, and I would agree with that. I would say that is true.
Sure.
But I just feel like this offense they're gonna have no choice but to build around their speed. Yeah. And I think they are. And when I look at just Tyree and Kyron Williams, there's nothing about Tommy Rees that makes me think he's going to say, hey, let's go 12 and 13 personnel all game against Wisconsin. I don't see him doing that.
Right.
I think he's going to look at the matchup and say, I don't know who on their team can run with Kevin Austin or Braden Lindsey or Xavier Watts or Avery Davis or Lawrence Keys,
right,
or Chris Tyree or Kyron Williams, and then make their linebackers have to spend all day worrying about Michael Mayer. If you can get their linebackers focused on Michael Mayer, then that's going to take away from their stunts and pressures. So, like, that's the one thing I would do is I would move Michael. I would, in the first 10 plays of the game, I'd have Michael Mayer line up in 7 different positions. Seriously.
Yeah. No,
and get their linebackers
because
and
I agree with
safeties being worried about, okay, where's Mayer going to be on display? Because if they're doing that, they're not worried about pressuring you and doing all these kind of blitzes and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I'm looking forward to seeing this matchup is we're going to learn a lot about Tommy Rees, because this is the first matchup where he's going against a really smart, proven successful defensive coordinator that's going to throw a lot at him. And if Tommy Rees can see, like, hey, I'll see your creativity and raise you a bootleg throwback deep drag where we ISO'd your backside, we ran off your backside with deep posts, and we brought Braden Lindsey on a delayed deep drag, and we're banging that for 6. I'm going to be like, okay, this cat is ready to go. Right? Stuff like that, where it's like, hey, you want to do this? Hey, we're going to do this, right? We're gonna make you pay for these stunts.
Right.
You want to bring these consistent. You want to blitz Blake Fisher all day. Right, because you think you can take advantage of him. We're going to hit you with about 3 angle routes and a tunnel screen right behind that, and you're going to think twice about doing that, right? Those are the kind of things that I want to see him do and what I mean by that is, like, so when you have a young left tackle and you have a really aggressive defense, they may do like they want to beat Notre Dame with numbers. They want to bring 3 guys and make Blake Fisher have to make decisions. So what can Notre Dame do about that? Well, one is you could just max pro, and now you're playing right into Wisconsin's hands because you're taking – your athletes off the field and putting them in position to have to help block. Here's some other things you can do. Motion Braden Lindsey or Lawrence Keys and send them on a crossing route and run right at those linebackers. And if they both blitz, then you've got Braden Lindsey in space against their nickel corner, and that ain't going to work out well for Wisconsin or Lawrence Keys or whoever. You run an angle route. An angle route is essentially just like this, right? We've seen Notre Dame do that. Where they blitz, he's going to go out like he's running like a slide route and going to come right back in behind those linebackers. Notre Dame's had a lot of success with that in recent years, including against South Florida last year. So you just kind of bang that right behind it. You can do things where you can run a tunnel screen where you invite that pass rush upfield and to just get that ball right over the top.
Yep.
Right. Those are just three things off the top of my head. You can run snag concepts, Vince, where you just kind of, you know, to snag, right? You bring that guy on a 45 to hitch, and then you have your back kind of go on like a little swing, and then your number two, your tight end runs a corner route, you know, where if those linebackers are both coming, then you've got that corner in a bind where is he going to play the snag or is he going to play the swing? And then now you've got the safety occupy with a corner route. So there's so many things Notre Dame can do schematically to take advantage of that as long as the game plan is sound and the execution is there, which I think both are going to be there. So that's kind of where I'm at with this part of it. You know what I mean? And so that's how I think this game is going to play out. I just do. I think we're going to see a lot of creativity by Notre Dame to take advantage of what they're going to do. And I think the fact that they play three undermanned teams the first three games, they're going to see a lot of this stuff. Purdue and Toledo and with Florida State, their coaches can't be stupid enough to think that they can just line up and play big boy football against Notre Dame. They're going to be bringing pressures and twists and stunts. So the Wisconsin game is not going to be the first time Notre Dame's going to see this stuff. I think that's another reason why I think the schedule sets up nicely for this Wisconsin game.
I do too.
And as long as Tommy Rees is up for the challenge, and I think that he will be, I think Notre Dame is going to really move the ball. I think this is going to be sort of the coming out party for Notre Dame. As long as, again, we think Notre Dame's going to play the game that we think they can play. In what Ashley was worried about earlier is we're always going to give you the good and the bad of a team. We're going to give you the matchups that we think Notre Dame's going to dominate. We're also going to give you the matchups that we are concerned about. That's what analysis is, right? But at the end of the day, when I start saying, how do I think this game's going to play out? If Notre Dame does what I think they're capable of doing, I just don't think this game is going to be competitive. And it's going to be that statement game for everybody to say, hey, unless Wisconsin loses to Penn State, then no one's going to care. Yeah, Wisconsin's not that good. They're 1-2. They lost to Penn State. Yeah. But if they beat Penn State at home and they're 2-0, they're going to be a top 10 to 12 team. And I think Notre Dame's going to blitz them. I really do. I think they're going to whoop them pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do that, that's kind of Notre Dame's, kick down the door like, kaboom, guess who stepped in the room? I mean, that's going to be Notre Dame's coming out party. And if anyone that listened to 80s and 90s rap music knows exactly what I'm referring to there. So that's what I see from this game. I think it's going to be that kind of matchup. But there's enough things that Wisconsin does well that I'm nervous about with Notre Dame, mainly the Notre Dame offensive line, that make me still a little bit nervous about this game. A little bit nervous about it. We do have a super chat, Vince. You want me to pull it up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Here we go.
John Klimek, thank you, sir, for the super chat very much. He says, move Mayer, let them point fingers at him all day. Williams will feast out of the backfield. No 240-pound backer is guarding either. Rees has to play the game. Yeah, completely agree. I mean, that's one of the advantages that Notre Dame has coming into this game. And if they stick with the 3-4, yes, Mayer's a good matchup. If they put 5 defensive backs on the field, Mayer's still a good matchup. So, he needs to be part of the equation every game. But absolutely.
I think John hit it, Vince, with them. He's talking about Mayer and Williams. There's a lot of high-low concepts that they can do with those two that isolate those linebackers. And again, if you're isolating linebackers with Mayer and Kyron Williams, or Mayer and Chris Tyree, or George Takis and Michael Mayer, or George Takis and Kyron Williams, or George Takis and Chris Tyree, you get the point? Then if they have to worry about those two guys early in the game, in the pass game, then you got to think twice about, okay, do we really want to blitz here? Do we really want to let them get Chris Tyree in space against a safety or another linebacker? Do we really want to risk of getting an isolation of Chris Tyree in space against Jack Sanborn? I don't think that's a matchup you want to do.
Right.
Or you may be a little less hesitant. And you may, because if you can force them to be in a situation where they have to back off their pressures, that plays right into Notre Dame's hands. Now Notre Dame can then start establishing the run game. So that's how I think it's going to play out, in my opinion. But I'm still just nervous enough to where I got to see the offensive line play well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I have to see it. And if they do, they'll be fine. If they don't, this could be a competitive game. This could be a little bit of a tricky game. No question about it. So let me I want to bring up a question here that we had before we move on to Cincinnati, because we've talked a lot about this game. Ladarius Martin, our resident Alabama fan, which we appreciate you being in here. We just sometimes don't want it to always be about Alabama. We want to talk about, Notre Dame. But I love you, Ladarius. I hear people talk about the 2018 Notre Dame versus Ball State game. I remember to a certain extent, but what was the final score that night? It was 24-16. Ball State did score late to make it that way. But the problem with that game is Ball State kept running line stunts on Notre Dame all game. Yeah, 2007 Domer, Brian Vince, you brought up the 2018 O-line training with Ball State. How much would a better passer like Cohn have been able to negate what they were doing, and does that translate to Wisconsin this year? It wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference. And honestly, I mean, Brandon Wimbush threw for almost 300 yards that game. He missed some throws, but but you just can't let those kind of run throughs happen. I don't care who your quarterback is. You just can't let guys run free to the quarterback like that. And that was the issue. And they couldn't run the ball. I mean, they couldn't run the ball on Ball freaking State. You know what I mean? Like that. I'm sorry. They ran for 117 yards on 41 carries against Ball State.
Right. That was the problem. Yeah, that was the problem. Because
they were just letting run throughs. I mean, the line stunts in that game were just ridiculously terrible.
Yeah.
And they could never get anything going. And then, of course, they forced Brandon Wimbush to be a pocket passer, which didn't help the offense much. And not only did they force him to be a pocket passer, but Chip Long forced him to be a pocket passer that game, and didn't do anything to get Brandon out of the pocket with the run game. And then the couple times he did, Brandon made big plays. So it was a poor game plan. And thought Chip Long did a lot of great things. That's not a game that I thought was one of his best games.
Sure.
But I don't know how much
I that too.
Yeah. Oh, I know he did. but I just don't think it was a better passer fixes that, because a better passer is still going to have problems with all the run throughs. It was the line games that really were the problem. And that's going to have to be the big thing. So that's where we are with Wisconsin. I think this is going to be this could be a really tough matchup for Notre Dame. If it's about big boy versus big boy, if this game becomes about speed versus speed, or who has the better athletes, this is going to be a big day for Notre Dame, and potentially could be a coming out party. But I keep looking at that schedule, Vince, and I keep looking at that opener against Penn State, and I'm thinking that game could take a lot of shine off of this game. A lot of shine off of this game.
You're right. If Wisconsin doesn't show up in that game, then this game doesn't mean as much.
Well,
as we thought it might
nationally,
yes.
But then here's my bigger thing: how now Wisconsin's backs are against the wall.
True.
This game means a whole lot. I mean, if you're Wisconsin, you can weather an early season Notre Dame loss and still make the playoff. I mean, the schedule's not great, but if they lose on a neutral field to a Notre Dame team in a competitive game, they're not going to fall much. And they're going to keep rising because they don't really play a lot of great teams the rest of the year. And then, of course, if they can pull off an upset against Ohio State at the end of the year, maybe they could be a playoff team.
Sure. Yeah.
So you lose to Penn State, now all of a sudden you're in do or die every week. You can't lose another game. That means you got to beat Notre Dame and you got to beat Ohio State.
Right.
I mean, so you're talking about third game of the year, and Wisconsin's sort of in a wounded animal mode.
Right.
And that kind of, plus if do you worry about the Notre Dame players saying, oh man, look what Penn State did to them, we're going to smack them. If Notre Dame comes into that game feeling real good about themselves, you want Wisconsin being at their best. Perception wise, it's good for Notre Dame that way. But also, if Wisconsin's 2-0 and ranked in the top 10-ish, there's no way the Notre Dame players are anything other than just amped to play this game. And so that's kind of what adds to make this. This is going to could be a really, really intriguing game, Vince. No question about it.
So we're going to move on to our next opponent preview, and we are talking about, Game 5, right, of the season. And we are talking about the Cincinnati Bearcats. And this is a home game for Notre Dame. It is an afternoon start. This is prior to the back-to-back night games for Notre Dame, even though I do think it would be fun to play Cincinnati at night, but that's a whole other conversation. Big game. This is a really, really big game. We know this is a big game for Cincinnati. Obviously, there's a former Notre Dame player over with Michael Young. There's former Notre Dame coach. Notre Dame has stolen their coaches. There's a lot about this game. There's a lot of storylines to this game. And and Cincinnati's a pretty good football team.
Did you mention that Mike Denbrock is the offensive coordinator at Cincinnati?
Former Notre Dame coach. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, and so this is a big game, and this is a really big game. And of course, people are going to say that this is a trap game for Notre Dame. They're going to say all these different things. I'm sorry, I don't see that. They're going to take this team very seriously because they're a good team. They're a really good team. And Brian Kelly has the utmost respect for Mike Denbrock, number one. Obviously, Coach Mickens, Coach Freeman, they have the utmost respect for Cincinnati. That's their former employer. Okay. There's no reason in any way that this should be a trap game for Notre Dame. There's no reason that they should look past this team. None of it. All you have to do is stick the film in of the Georgia game, and that's really all you need to say because this team can play, and they got most of their guys coming back from that team. So go ahead, Brian.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Keep going, Vince. You're on a roll, man. I love it. It looked like you're going to pause, and then you kept going again, so I apologize. Keep going.
No, it's all good. I'm really looking forward to this game, and I think Cincinnati deserves a ton of respect for what they've been doing the last few years. I think Luke Fickell deserves a ton of respect for what he's done down in Cincinnati. He took over a program that was struggling. Yeah. I mean, just struggling. And he has put them in position to be something special. Obviously, they went undefeated last year. They were a field goal away from winning that game against Georgia. I mean, they dominated Georgia in the first half. Absolutely dominated them. A lot of that had to do with the defense, but a lot of that had to do with the Ritter kid at quarterback too. That kid's special. Okay. And so again, this is a big game for Notre Dame. I don't care if it's Cincinnati. I don't care that it's a sub Power 5 team or however you want to look at it. I am very happy that this game is at home for Notre Dame. Let's just put it that way.
Vince, could Notre Dame lose this game? Sure. Yes. Cincinnati's a really good football team.
Sure.
It's not a trap game.
No.
Because there's no way in the world that Notre Dame overlooks Cincinnati. Trap game is a team where it's like, you don't expect them to lose and maybe overlook them a little bit. It comes at a weird time.
Right.
This is a home game in week 5 against a team that Notre Dame, you think Marcus Freeman is going to let that defense kind of be like, no big deal. You think guys on that team that know Michael Young, that played with Michael Young, are going to be like, do you think anyone has ever watched Jerome Ford and him rip off long run after long run last year? The Alabama transfer at running back. No one's going to overlook this football team.
Right.
They're going to see the mock drafts that I know these kids read. They're going to say, hey, 3 Cincinnati kids have been mock drafted in the first round, different times, all that. They're not overlooking this team. If Cincinnati beats them, it's because Cincinnati outplays Notre Dame. This is not a game Notre Dame's going to overlook. And Cincinnati, it's going to be interesting to see where Cincinnati's at because the game before, because again, another team with a bye week. So, it's going to be the theme all year. So let's just get it out of the way now.
Yeah, you're right.
But they play Miami of Ohio in week 1. That should be a W. They play Murray State in week 2. If that's not a W, then we no longer have to worry about this game. And then they play at Indiana.
That's gonna be a tough game for them.
That's gonna be really
pretty
good
evenly matched
matchup.
Teams. Yeah, absolutely.
I think Cincinnati's got better talent. I think Indiana's got really good coaching, and Indiana has a really good quarterback.
And it's at Indiana, so that benefits.
And I think I think that game's gonna be good for Cincinnati because it's gonna give them a really good road test. They're gonna play away from home. Like a lot of times these early season games, this is really your first. You play a team like Notre Dame. A lot of times it can be your first really good road test. They're going to have a good road test before they come to South Bend. That's going to be a part of this too. And, Notre Dame's a different animal than Indiana, but Indiana's going to be able to show some things. If Indiana plays well that game, even if Cincinnati wins, it's got like Wisconsin and Penn State. They're going to expose some things that Notre Dame is going to get to see. Okay, they really went after this guy. But Cincinnati probably has the best defensive personnel that Notre Dame is going to face all year, which is going to make that really interesting. But just the storylines are going to be great. I'm really looking forward to this game. I think this is going to be a fun game.
Yeah,
I think this is going to be a game that's going to get a lot of attention because there's going to be a lot in the national media. They're going to be wanting Cincinnati to win this game.
Oh, of
Not
course.
for an anti-Notre Dame reasons, but there's a lot. We saw it at Boise. We saw it at UCF. They want a group of 5 to break through.
Exactly. Who's going to be
that earn it on the field, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's been the big thing for the group of 5, right? Is you got to earn it. You got to earn it on the field. We can't just because you're 12-0. If Cincinnati goes 13-0 this year, they should be in the playoff because they're going to have beaten 2 Power 5s on the road. Basically, they're going to have beaten Indiana on the road. They're going to beat what's going to be a 10+ win potentially Notre Dame team on the road. So this is a huge opportunity for Cincinnati. At the end of the day, however, I love what Luke Fickell's done, but this is not a team, in my opinion, that top to bottom can play with Notre Dame. I'm sorry. I am not on the Cincinnati can beat Notre Dame hype train.
Right.
Number one, the Georgia game, you know my stand. I don't care about bowl games. Does anybody think Georgia took Cincinnati as seriously in a bowl? We've seen Georgia is notoriously doesn't give a crap about bowl games if it's not the playoff.
Right.
I mean, did you watch them against Baylor a couple years ago? Did you watch them against Texas? You know, they only beat Baylor because they had better players. They didn't want to be at that game, and then they got embarrassed by Texas a few years ago because it shows to me another reason why I don't think Kirby Smart's a very good coach. One of many reasons I don't think he's a very good coach. Great recruiter, not a great coach. Cincinnati did a great job that game, but Georgia just had better athletes. That's what that game showed. And I don't think it's going to be any different when they play Notre Dame. So, yes, this is a team that is capable of beating Notre Dame. I'd be shocked if Notre Dame loses this game, though. I just would. I don't see it. I think if Brian Kelly hadn't come from Cincinnati and Mike Denbrock wasn't there, meaning they knew him, not that him being there doesn't hurt them, but just Notre Dame players know him, respect him. Tom Reese knows him, respects him. Mike Elson knows him, respects him, that kind of thing. If Marcus Freeman hadn't come from Cincinnati, like if all that wasn't there, maybe Notre Dame overlooks them. And that's how Cincinnati could win.
Right. We didn't even mention the fact that that's where Brian Kelly used to be head coach. I realize there's no connections there anymore.
Yeah.
It's still where he used to be head coach.
Right.
You don't want to lose to that team.
Right.
So, again, those are all off the field stories.
No way.
But
and
still.
Brian Kelly will play that down. He will.
Oh, of course.
And he
will.
should. Like, guys, I've been at Cincinnati 12 years, 13 years, right?
Absolutely. But it's a storyline.
But it's going to be a storyline because the connections that are there, Marcus Freeman, Mike Denbrock, Michael Young, there's a lot of connections there.
Mike Mickens, a lot of Michaels.
Mike Mickens. We didn't even mention Mike Mickens. I forgot about that. Yeah. So, you rated their defensive staff.
A lot of Michaels. Young, Mickens.
Yeah, Denbrock. So, to me, I think Cincinnati was a good story last year. I honestly, Vince, I think Cincinnati's getting a little bit more hype than they should because of the Georgia game. I think Cincinnati was a pretty darn good football team last year. I just don't see a real special offense. That's the problem for me. I think their defense was really good last year.
Yeah.
I just don't think their offense was real special, to be honest with you.
Their defense was special, and I think their defense is what won them games.
And should still be really, really good.
It should still be really, really good. But again, the defensive coordinator isn't on Cincinnati's side anymore. And I'm not saying that's the be-all, end-all, but that's a big deal. That's a big deal. I'm sorry. I can't downplay that part of it, okay? That's just me.
I agree with you to an extent.
Yeah.
And the extent being that, like, Luke Fickell is a defensive guy.
Fair enough.
Like that, it'd be kind of like it to me. It's kind of like when Alabama loses a D coordinator, nobody flips out because it's like, well, it's fine. It's Nick Saban's defense.
Yeah, right.
I'm not saying that it was Luke Fickell's defense, but having Luke Fickell as a head coach doesn't hurt you if you're a defensive coordinator.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And they hired somebody is it Mike Tressel, right? Mike Tressel, yes. who knows Luke Fickell, knows that defense. So it's still going to be the same defense that they face. They're going to know that let's kind of dive in to the personnel, but I want to get to that now.
Yeah.
Here, let's start with the Cincinnati offense. Okay. Let's get into that because we're going to start kind of talking big picture about them. Let's just dive into those now, Vince.
Love it.
So the first part of it is the Cincinnati offense. There's some talent there. And that can be big plays, and that could be the neutralizer. That could make I don't think this is really going to be super close game look bad because Michael Young can be a big play threat. He started to really come along, but Jerome Ford's not like a great every down running back, but Jerome Ford is he takes one wrong gap assignment and turns it into a 60-yard touchdown.
He's Dexter Williams.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like that's
exactly
who he is. And
exactly.
And that kind of back scares me. You know what I mean? Because one mistake and it's off to the races. And
we showed that against Georgia. He only carried the ball 8 times, and we went for 97 yards and a touchdown.
Exactly. That touchdown was sweet looking, man.
He had 116 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 9 carries against Memphis last year.
Right.
So, of course, then there's other games, Tulsa or UCF, 3 carries for 5 yards. So you got to limit the big plays.
Yes. Yes.
The issue for me, though, Vince, is that when I look at this football team and I look at their overall talent, like they've got a couple guys, but like I look at those other receivers, they don't scare me. I do like the tight end, Josh Wiley. I remember him coming out of high school. Notre Dame looked at him, didn't offer him, but looked at him. Good football player. So they got a couple weapons, but the thing for me is their offensive line was solid last year. It wasn't great, and they lose their left side. I think to me that's the issue for me. I think that is where I just don't see this team. I see Notre Dame giving them a lot of problems, in my opinion. I don't think that they can protect the quarterback as well. And I like Desmond Ridder, but I think some of the hype about Desmond Ridder, based on what he's been, is a little bit more than it should be, in my opinion.
Okay.
He averaged, I believe, if I'm correct on this, I'm gonna look this up. I'm not gonna say something that's incorrect. I think I'm right on this, but I want to look up the numbers first. Yes, he averaged fewer passing yards per game last year than Ian Book did.
Ooh.
And he's a good runner.
He's a good runner.
Ran for 592 yards, 12 touchdowns. Again, very similar to Ian Book.
Second leading rusher, I believe, off the top of my head when I was reading about him.
So
he's accounted for 79 touchdowns in his 3 years. Right. I mean, he is
a good football player.
Yeah, he's a good football player. He's one of the – okay, let me ask you this, just so people can put it into perspective. So if you took all 12 quarterbacks that Notre Dame is going to face, kind of where – you don't have to be specific, but like kind of where does he rank – in those 12?
As far as like prototype NFL talent, he's in the top 2. Okay. But again, he hasn't turned that prototype because he's 6'4". He's an athletic guy. He's got a big arm, but he's not – his decision-making has never been like super – honestly, Vince, he reminds me a lot of Ian Book, a more physically talented Ian Book.
Okay.
What I mean by that is – good player, but not a real fast processor of reads. That was an issue for Book for his entire career.
Oh yeah.
Doesn't like, and his anticipation's not great. Those kind of things that you'd think a guy that's played as much as he's played would have looked better at that last year.
Sure.
This is not a rookie. This is a guy that's been around for a while.
This would be his fourth year starting. Fourth.
Yeah. You'd think that you'd see some progress in those areas, and he hasn't really. He hasn't really done it. Now last year was a jump for him. He was at 188 yards as a freshman. He threw for 20 touchdowns, 5 picks. That was actually his best year passing the ball, if we're going to be honest about it. 20 touchdowns, 5 picks, 146.42 quarterback rating. Next year as a sophomore, he goes out, throws 18 touchdowns, 9 picks, throws for 166.5 yards per game. 55.5% completion percentage, and saw a big jump in completion percentage last year, 66.2. 8.2 yards per attempt is pretty good. 19 touchdowns, 6 picks, 152 quarterback rating. Again, that's real similar to kind of what we saw from Ian Book. 64.46% completion percentage for Ian Book. Average 235.8 passing yards per game, 15 touchdowns, 3 picks, 8.0 yards per attempt. These numbers were very similar to Ian Book's.
Yeah.
And some of the weaknesses that I think he has are very similar. Now, he doesn't get bothered by pressure as much as Ian Book did. He's a little bit more poised in that regard. He's going to look for a run lane, but he's fine getting out of the pocket and keeping his eyes downfield and throwing over the top. So I think he's more poised than Ian Book was. But I see a lot of the same issues that he had, that Ian Book had, I also see from Desmond Ridder. That he's going to have to make some big jumps, in my opinion, from can you process the defense? Can you make quick decisions? Can you get the ball out quickly down the field? And you saw in the Georgia game, if you look at some of his numbers, you're like, hey, you went 24 of 37 against Georgia for 2 touchdowns, completed 64.9% of his passes. But only throw for 206 yards and averaged 5.6 yards per attempt, which means he was, if you remember that game, he was dinking and dunking the whole game because he just he just wasn't willing to pull the trigger down the field. Sound familiar?
Sound familiar? Yeah, I was going to say, where have I heard that before? Yeah.
So that's kind of my issue. It's like, I look at Ian Book, and I've said this, like, if you look at Ian Book against Alabama, 27 of 39 completed 69.2% of his throws, right? It's pretty good.
Good numbers.
Threw for 229 yards, 5.9 yards per attempt.
Right.
Again,
that's not going to win you any games. It's going to give you a high percentage, but yeah.
That's kind of where I'm coming from. It's like that. I didn't see that kind of strong play. Now, I'll say this. He was a lot better down the stretch last year. He was really good against East Carolina, really good against Central Florida, really good against Tulsa. I think what happened is a lot of people didn't start paying attention to Cincinnati until those games.
Right.
And that's the only version of Desmond Ridder they saw.
Sure. No, I get that. Yeah, I get that.
And they didn't see the guy that threw for 126 yards and went 6.0 yards per attempt against SMU. You know what I mean? They didn't see that guy.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't see the guy that struggled against South Florida. And I think that's where, when you look at the whole film, say, okay, well, is he going to be that guy that we saw late in the year? Well, against Georgia, I saw the guy that we saw earlier in the year. That's the problem. A guy that wasn't willing to wasn't making quick decisions, wasn't getting rid of the ball in time. There were opportunities for them to make big plays against Georgia, and he just wasn't willing to let it rip in that game, which again is very similar to what we've talked about with Ian Book in the past. So
just unwilling to make the big mistake.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those are the things that I look at, Vince, and I say, boy, I don't know. If I'm Notre Dame, I'm going after him. Because, look, Cincinnati, you look at the final score against SMU, and it's 42-13, and it looks really impressive, but it was 14-10 at halftime, and they took advantage. I mean, he had a nice long run late. Cincinnati scored 2 touchdowns in the final 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah.
And put a little bit on it, but that was a great job by the defense is really what that game was all about. They just shut down a really good SMU offense. And that was sort of, to me, the coming out party for the Cincinnati defense.
Yeah. But, defense gave up 16 points a game. So, I mean, they were pretty much good all season. Yeah.
Right. So when I look at this game, Vince, that to me is the thing. Schematically, when I break down Cincinnati, I see a lot of familiar stuff, and because we see it's Mike Denbrock, run the offense.
Right.
A lot of stuff we're going to see. They're going to run some read zone. They're going to run some play action. They're going to do some stuff that's kind of spreadish because of Desmond Ridder. But pass game wise, it's going to look a lot like the stuff that we saw, we've seen sort of at Notre Dame. So there's going to be some familiarity there where I think Notre Dame's going to have greater familiarity with what Cincinnati's going to do offensively than Cincinnati's going to have with what Notre Dame does offensively.
Sure.
Because number one, Marcus Freeman's had those sit-down sessions with Mike Freeman. They've talked football. He knows how, they know how each other thinks. I think that's going to benefit Mark. I've always said, who benefits from those matchups? The dude with the better players.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's the key. So Cincinnati has some individual players that concern me in this game, but I think Notre Dame should be able to win in the trenches. And I think Notre Dame should be able to scheme enough to really confuse Desmond Ridder and force him either A, into big mistakes, or B, into just dumping it off all day.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see it. And that's going to be key. And if you can limit the big plays on Cincinnati, they're not good enough offensively, in my opinion, to just consistently go up and down the field on you. That's why you have to limit the big plays. But that's also the part that scares me a little bit because Michael Young and Jerome Ford can be they catch you in a blitz.
Yes. Right. Look, Michael Young's legit. I mean, I was disappointed when Michael Young left, when he left Notre Dame. That hurt the wide receiving core that year, no question. And, and we've seen.
Do you remember how good he was that spring and going into fall camp before he broke his collarbone and got knocked out?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He was going to be their number one receiver that year. I mean, number two, their number one X receiver in 2019. Chase was their number one guy, but I'm talking about X. I want to make sure I'm clear. He was not going to be better than Chase Claypool. I meant their number one X receiver that year.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I was disappointed when he left, and we've seen what Ford can do when he can bust one long. And so, look, when you have a team that's more talented than the other team, and I'm sorry, Notre Dame's more talented than Cincinnati. I mean, that's understood, right? They're an AAC team. What can lose you games is turnovers and big plays, right? And that's what we're talking about. You have to limit those big plays, and you've got to limit turnovers. I mean, if you can do that, you're going to win this game. I mean, Cincinnati's a really, really good team. Don't get me wrong. They're a good team, but Notre Dame's a better team. And as long as they don't give up those big plays and they don't turn the ball over, Notre Dame's going to win. I mean, and I know it's not that simple, but sometimes it is. You know what I mean? I'm trying not to make it that simple, but I really feel like that it is that simple with this Cincinnati ball club. I don't see Cincinnati necessarily sustaining long offensive drives against this defense, right? I just don't. I'm sorry, I don't.
It's going to be about big plays.
Yeah.
And taking advantage of turnovers.
Exactly
from the Notre Dame offense.
That's what I'm saying.
That is where I get a little bit nervous.
To your point. Yeah.
And so that's a nice segue into the other side of the ball.
Right.
This is the side of the ball that is Cincinnati's legitimately on the level could be on the level of Notre Dame. There's not another team on the schedule, in my opinion, that has the top 4 or 5 players on defense that Cincinnati has. Ahmad Gardner, they call him Sauce Gardner, right? That's the best cornerback, in my opinion, Notre Dame's going to face all year. Myjai Sanders is probably the best edge rusher they're going to face all year. They've got 2 really good inside linebackers. Their Mike and their Will from last year are back, and they're big. They're 235 and 260. They're 2 inside linebackers, very experienced players. They lost their rover, Jarrell White, who's gone. I believe he's gone, and yes, he is gone. But they returned 3 starters in the secondary, and they remember Malik Vann. He was a guy that Notre Dame recruited. He's going to start for them.
Yep.
Jawan Briggs, right, another guy that Notre Dame recruited a couple years ago, ended up not taken. He transferred in for them. He played at Virginia, if you'll recall. So for people that obsess over recruiting rankings, there's a couple former 4-star recruits. Jawan Briggs, I think ESPN, had him as like a top 100 recruit. Now that was kind of nonsense. There's a reason he went to Virginia, not Notre Dame or Ohio State or Michigan, right? Being from Cincinnati. But he's still a good football player. So they're going to have some good depth up front. They're going to have size up front, and they're going to have an aggressive, physical secondary. This is the game where we're going to learn more about the Notre Dame receiving corps than any team on the roster, because Cincinnati's going to come up and say, I'm better than you. And Notre Dame's going to say, no, you're not, and prove it. And that's going to be a challenge. Can Kevin Austin make plays against Sauce Gardner? Can Braden Lindsey and those guys make plays against the other Cincinnati cornerbacks? That's a legitimate question that's going to go a long way towards determining, because the Notre Dame defense could shut down the Cincinnati offense, and it's a 17-14 game in the fourth quarter. Cincinnati gets the ball with a chance to go win it. Yeah. Right?
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be up to the offense. And this is the team that defensively has some of the horses that could say, yeah, this isn't your typical group of 6 defense, and it's not. And the foundation that Marcus Freeman built from an attitude standpoint, from a fundamental standpoint, is still going to be there. Mm-hmm. That doesn't just go away because Marcus Freeman left. Especially since, where did Marcus Freeman learn that? Who was his position coach when he was a player at Ohio State?
The head coach at Cincinnati?
Luke Fickell. Right.
Yeah.
So who did he learn? Who did he grow as a defensive coordinator to the point where he became a guy that Notre Dame wants? It was under Luke Fickell, right? Like that's not a coincidence. So that's the side of the ball, Vince, that really troubles me. And it's going to start. Let's start in the secondary, because I want to kind of work this one back to front a little different than normal.
Okay.
What do we talk all offseason about how the Notre Dame secondary is going to play? Aggressive and all that. What I'm curious about is, was that a Marcus Freeman thing, or is that a Luke Fickell thing? We're going to find that out. Are they going to be as aggressive playing coverage as – I would imagine so, because of Mike Tressel, came from Michigan State, and that's kind of who Michigan State is. But that's going to be the thing that, Vince, that I first want to find out is Cincinnati going to still play the same type of aggressive coverage schemes as what they played in the past? Because if they do, I think, let me rephrase, they should. And I imagine they would. I mean, Mike Tressel, I'm looking at this, he was at Michigan State from 2007 to 2020. What is the one thing Mark D'Antoni was always known for? Press coverage, quarters, aggressive press and bump and run. So I'll be shocked if they're not playing the same thing.
Sure.
And so Notre Dame's going to have to we're going to have to be prepared. Meaning of seeing that as we break down Cincinnati, and then Notre Dame's going to have to be prepared for it. But that's a concern for me, because Notre Dame has not done well in recent seasons against cornerbacks who press a lot, because they're just their press technique has never been very advanced. And now you've got an undersized group of receivers for the most part. That's a concerning matchup for me.
Sure. Excuse me. Wow. No, not sure where that came from.
Yeah. Puberty hits late sometimes for some people. You just never know.
Yeah. It's calling me Bobby Brady. But here's my thing. And we're talking about the wide receivers and things of that nature for Notre Dame. If Notre Dame plays and wins the way I think that they're going to play and win against Wisconsin, I think that benefits Notre Dame coming into this game, because I think those wide receivers are going to have some swagger about them. I think they're going to have some juice behind them a little bit, and they'll be like, look what we just did against this Big Ten team. Let's go. You know,
I get what you're saying, but to me, that would be a little bit of false confidence, because with all due respect to Wisconsin, Cincinnati has way better athletes in the secondary than Wisconsin.
I agree with that. No, I'm not. I agree
that
with your
Big
premise.
Ten team doesn't have the athletes this AAC team has on defense.
I agree with your premise, but at the same time, I feel like this team, these wide receivers have not experienced major success yet. You know what I mean? And they could experience that major success against Wisconsin. And
let me interrupt you, Vince. I want to interrupt you because I think this super chat is asking a question that's going to kind of lead to what you're talking about here.
Fair enough.
Corey D asks, Vince and Brian, do you consider Cincinnati to be a more talented team than Wisconsin in terms of being disciplined? I give the edge to Wisconsin. I think they're both pretty disciplined, to be honest with you. But I think this is a really good question, Vince, and it speaks to what, kind of what you're talking about is you talk about, let's say Notre Dame has the success against Wisconsin that you and I talked about that they could have in the previous part of the show. How does that actually translate to Cincinnati? Because as I think you agree with me, especially in the secondary, I think it's more debatable in the front seven. I think you can make a case that Wisconsin overall has better top to bottom talent than Wisconsin does or Cincinnati does.
Yeah, right.
We would both agree that Sanders is the best of anybody, but just top to bottom, you could argue maybe Cincinnati or Wisconsin has a little bit better front seven players. In the secondary, it's not close, in my opinion. And that's no knock on them, but I mean, Cincinnati has a legitimate All-American potential first-round draft pick at corner. Wisconsin doesn't have anyone that's going to go day or one or two in secondary, right? So as we kind of talk about this, if you could answer Corey's question, in your opinion, do you consider Cincinnati? And let's focus on the defense right now.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Do you consider Cincinnati to be the more talented team? I think overall, I do think Cincinnati is more talent.
Because I do think they have more talent in the secondary. I think the kid at defensive end that you mentioned, Sanders, I think he's probably better than anybody that Wisconsin has in their front. And so frontline players, I think Cincinnati's is a more talented team defensively. And so this is going to be a good test for Notre Dame, no question. And what I was saying about, the way they play against Wisconsin, I still think that is going to help them, right? Because I want confident players, obviously. And if they struggle against Wisconsin, our preview the week of the Cincinnati game is going to not be as positive as I want it to be. You know what I mean? Even if they come away with the victory, I'm going to be very hesitant going into the Cincinnati game with what the wide receivers in the passing game. And, that will worry me. Absolutely. And so that's what I mean more about being successful against Wisconsin, helping them against Cincinnati. So you're right. This is going to be a test. And we think that Notre Dame is going to really do a good job offensively with the pass game and getting guys in space and all of that. This is the test. This is the test up to this point, up at 5 games. This is the test.
Because you can scheme up Cincinnati, but the difference is if you scheme up Wisconsin, you're going to crush them because your dudes are better than their dudes.
Right.
I don't know if that's true against this game. I'll say this: if Notre Dame throws the ball effectively on Cincinnati, I'm going to be like, they're going to score on anybody.
Yeah, right.
I mean, because this is a really good defense.
Yes.
And again, I want to emphasize, like, everyone's fired up about Marcus Freeman as a coordinator. Well, the things that made him a great coordinator didn't just disappear from the conscience or the ethic of those Cincinnati players. It's still there. That discipline is still there. That the confidence that he instills in them is still there. It's not going to vanish because he's not there anymore.
Right.
Now, 2-3 years when the players that he coached aren't really there anymore, that's when you see changes. But
I wish they were senior laden last year, but they're not.
Exactly. Like if they, like to your point, if they'd have lost like 8 starters, right?
Right.
Exactly.
It's a different conversation. Yeah, exactly.
But they've got 7 starters coming back on defense, right? And they have a lot of guys that were in the rotation. So like Malik Vann technically is not listed as a starter. Last year, he's a starter now. But you watch them play last year. Malik Vann was basically a starter. I mean, as far as they rotated a ton.
Right.
He played a ton because Marcus Freeman actually did a lot of rotating with his front 4 last year. Mm-hmm. They had a situation where if they wanted to go with bigger personnel, they'd bring in a 4th defensive lineman. He was considered an outside linebacker, Ethan Trickey, but he was a guy that was kind of a bigger guy. So we've seen questions. Somebody, I think John Klimek asked, Brian, what is their depth like, though? You mentioned those players, but Notre Dame is going to keep coming at them, playing aggressive, can wear you down. Yes, but that's the thing. Cincinnati has pretty good depth. I mentioned their 3 starters on the defensive line because, again, they're a 3-down team. Sanders is back, right? Marcus Brown is a starter. He's a senior. And then they have Malik Vann, who's starting at the other defensive end. Malik Vann played a ton. Jawan Briggs is there. He's not a starter. He started as an ace. He started at Virginia as a freshman. He's going to be there. So there's good depth there. There really is. So to your point, Notre Dame can wear them down because Cincinnati's not real big. They're starting 3 defensive linemen, Vince. Their nose tackle's 297, but Sanders is 258 and Van's 275. So a similar issue to what we talked about with Notre Dame's D-line against Wisconsin is now true of Cincinnati, their front 3, but then they've got Beavers, who's 260, and their middle linebacker, DeBlanco. Is it DeBlanco? Yeah, DeBlanco. He's 235, 240. He's a big thumper kind of kid. So they're going to have some – they're going to crash. Those 2 big linebackers are going to crash all game long against Notre Dame's run game.
Right. And this is also going to be a test for Notre Dame's run game. I really feel that way because – you can go at a team's strength, but you can also go after their weakness. And if the strength is in the secondary, well, by default, the weakness is against the run game, right? So I have no problem. We're talking about week 5 at this point. It'd be nice to get the run game on a roll here a little bit and seeing what they can do and seeing what this offensive line can do, because by week 5, we should have a pretty good idea what this offensive line can be. Right. And this is an opportunity for them to impose their will on a smaller defense for sure. Whether that'll be the case, I'll let you know after week 4, how I feel about that. But I really think this is an opportunity for Notre Dame's offense to establish the run game. And then the Cincinnati defense is going to have to kind of adjust some things that they want to do, and that could open up the pass game. So, we'll see how things play out, but I feel like that's a possibility.
I think you hit it right there, Vince. They have to establish a run game. And look, last year Cincinnati had a really good run defense. They gave up 182 yards to Army. Well, giving up 182 yards to Army,
that's really low.
Really good.
Yeah, they only gave up 111 yards total. Average all season.
Right. Army averaged 273 yards rushing. It's like Notre Dame holding Navy to 180. You hold a triple option team under 200 yards rushing, you did a great job.
Yes, absolutely.
And they did that. They held them to 183 yards. They had one bad game last year. That was against East Carolina. They gave up 206 yards. But it was a game they won 55-17. It was kind of like the Syracuse game for Notre Dame. It's like those numbers weren't all that. This was a really good run defense last year. A lot of it was schematic. The reason that matters is because Georgia in their game rushed for 45 yards, averaged 1.9 yards per carry. With all those big offensive linemen and big time running backs they average 1.9 yards per carry against Cincinnati. What Notre Dame has to do in this game, in my opinion, is they have to be able to establish the running game to a degree. They don't have to run for 250 yards, but they have to make Cincinnati respect the run.
Exactly.
And then keep it to where if they can force Cincinnati to put more numbers in the box, then there's going to be some matchups, especially here's the big one. If the receivers can just have some success, right? And just make a few plays. You don't have to make a ton. But keep it to where you can somehow force them to defend the run. That's going to put you in some situations where you're going to get Avery Davis and Lawrence Keys, Michael Mayer, George Takis. There's going to be some one-on-ones down the middle of the field that you can exploit if they have to respect your outside guys. Now, what we saw last year is there are times where they didn't respect the outside guys, and those corners would be quick to come off of a vertical route and close on the inside. If you're having success in the perimeter, they're not going to be as prone to do that because you're just going to throw some back shoulders and some things like that to Kevin Austin. So that's where I think Notre Dame could really take advantage. If, to your point, Vince, if they can establish some semblance of a run game, and to the point you were making, you're game 5 now.
Right.
You got to start running the ball now. And if you're not running the ball by now, I got to –
That's what I'm saying. Like that, if after week 4 we are not confident in what the offensive line can do in the run game, we're having a completely different conversation. And I think that's the big deal here because we are rapidly approaching the midpoint of the season, And we should have a lot of our answers at this point. Now, there may be some dangling questions out there, but we should have a lot of our answers as far as what is this offensive line capable of? What does this offensive philosophy look like? All of those things. And I think we'll be able to better predict what Notre Dame is going to be doing. And this conversation could change, but there's still all those questions out there that we talked about yesterday as to where we just don't know enough yet. And by week 4, week 5, we should have more of a handle on what Notre Dame's offense is going to look like.
So let's kind of wrap this Cincinnati talk up. There's actually a couple good questions that I think are relevant to this, Vince.
Cool.
Brandon asks, when do you think Cincinnati would have had the best chance to beat Notre Dame? Last year's team versus last year's Notre Dame team, or this year's team versus this year? I think last year.
Last year.
Number one, Marcus Freeman was still there. But number two, Notre Dame would not have been able to beat them in the pass game.
Right, because of all the weapons that they have.
They would have not got off the line of scrimmage against Cincinnati's corners last year. Would not have happened. And that was the one thing that Skoranek and Javon McKinley struggled with. And that's something that I hope the Notre Dame coaches have addressed this offseason, because that's been an issue for a few years, is receivers being able to get off the line. I mean, the only guys that had any success really with it were Claypool and Boykin, and they just did it because of their size. They just push you off the line. So I think Notre Dame would have struggled to score on Cincinnati last year. Now, I think it would have been it would have looked a lot like the Georgia game. It would have been like 20-something to 20-something or 20-17. But I also think Notre Dame would have ran the ball on them a little bit. I think Notre Dame might have been able to win it at the end. But I would have worried about Cincinnati being able to make big plays on last year's defense. Last year's secondary was not good.
Right.
And last year's linebackers were not good. I think Mike Denbrock would have been able to scheme his way into some points. I think last year would have been a much better opportunity for Cincinnati to win. I think this year's Notre Dame team matches up a lot better. They're going to have more speed on offense on the field. They're going to have, in my opinion, a defense that's going to be better. Guys are healthier. Some guys are older. I think this is going to be a better defense than it was last year, just personnel-wise. It's not because Marcus Freeman's better than Clark Lee. I'm not even getting into that. But I think last year was the better shot for them. Plus, last year, if they would have played each other this year and last year would have been at Cincinnati. So, because the home and home nature of it, it wouldn't have been at Notre Dame. So, and that's the final piece of this, Vince, is to me, it's you look at it and say Notre Dame hasn't lost a home game since losing to Georgia by a point in 2017. I just don't think Cincinnati's that team that's going to end
break
that, to be honest with you.
Right.
And then another good – did you want to add something to that, Vince?
Oh, no. Continue. I'll add later.
Zach Garza just joined the chat. Which game do you guys think will be more heated, Cohn against his former squad or Freeman against his former squad? I don't think it's going to be – I think it's going to be Wisconsin, but not because of it's going to be more heat, because of that. I think that's just the way Wisconsin's a little chippy. Sometimes I think they play a little bit further past the whistle than you're supposed to play past the whistle. Have you ever noticed that about Wisconsin, especially their defense?
Through the echo of the whistle?
Yeah, they talk a lot of trash. I think that's something also that's going to hurt Wisconsin that game. It's kind of like, do you really want to poke the bear?
Yeah, sure.
I think that game's going to be a little bit more heated. I think also they play with a little bit more of a chip on their shoulder. I think I think the Cincinnati game is going to be more about respect.
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of program.
Because of the back and forth between the two.
And because of the fact, Marcus Freeman's not going to be running his mouth about Cincinnati all week. He's got too much respect for those guys, and he's got too much respect for Luke Fickell. Brian Kelly's not going to be running his mouth about Cincinnati. I think that's going to be a hard-fought game, but I think that's going to be a game of two programs that have a great deal of respect for each other. I don't think the same thing is going to be true for Wisconsin. I think there's a right that kind of heated. It only happens when you don't like your opponent. When there's two teams that respect the heck out of each other, they're going to bang and they're going to hit and they're going to play hard, but there's not going to be the shoving, the pushing, the heat. What I refer to as heated that you used. Wisconsin's going to be one that I think will be that way because I don't think there's going to be a lot of respect there. I don't think Notre Dame necessarily likes the Big Ten. I think the Big Ten teams kind of have this chip on their shoulder about Notre Dame. There's a lot of, they hate us because they ain't us kind of there with the Big Ten. And I think that, and just the way that Wisconsin plays, they always play with a chip on their shoulder. And honestly, they have to.
Yeah, right.
They're not good enough not to.
Right.
They need to play that way. So I don't hate them for it. I don't disrespect them for it. I'm not mad at them for it. They got to do it. And so, people have accused Kurt Hinish of being that, right? And I said, well, if he stops being that way, he's not going to be any good.
Right,
He's not good enough to just be like I'm going to show up and be really. He has to play kind of like with his hair on fire and like a bit of a crazy man, because that's the only he's going to be successful. So
he is, yeah, right. We do have we do have a Cincinnati fan in the house.
Okay,
so
who's
I
that?
want to highlight Joey here.
Okay.
Joey, not Votto, but Votto, possibly.
I have a feeling it's playing off of
I know
the
I'm
old
just
red
kidding.
first baseman.
But anyway, he's still there. He's in like his 100th season. But from a Cincinnati perspective, absolutely this year with a better chance to win, since he's going to be even better than last year.
They may be, but Notre Dame's going to be a lot better than they were last year,
right?
Especially on offense. So, and again, as we talked about, last year's game would have been at Cincinnati.
Correct.
It'd be one thing if there's going to be no way Notre Dame's going to overlook Cincinnati. None. Just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I feel like if Notre Dame's going to lose a game this year, it's going to be a game that we don't expect. It's not going to be North Carolina or USC or Wisconsin or Cincinnati. It's going to be Virginia Tech or Virginia. It's like, who did Clemson lose to in 2016 when they won a national championship, right? They didn't lose to Auburn, who they played in the non-conference. They lost to flipping Pitt at home.
Right.
A team that went 7-7 that year, right? Or 7-6 or something ridiculous like that. Who did Clemson lose to in 2017? It was a 4-8 Syracuse team. Who did Ohio State lose to in 2017? It was an 8-5 Iowa team. Who did they lose to in 2018? It was a 6-7 Purdue team. It's never the really good team. Alabama, when they play the considered the next best SEC team, Georgia, A&M, they usually smack those teams. When Alabama's lost, it's like, you lost to Ole Miss? Really? You lost to that Auburn team?
Yeah.
Like, seriously? And so, the only time I've ever seen Alabama lose to a team that was considered on their level was LSU in 2019. And I would argue that they weren't on LSU's level.
Yeah.
I think that LSU team was a lot better than Alabama was in 2019. I don't think, because of all the injuries Alabama had, that just was not the same Alabama team. And LSU was just otherworldly that year. They just smacked everybody. And they beat Alabama by 5, but anybody who watched that game knew that it was not as close as that 5-point score showed. So when I look at it, Vince, that's kind of how I view it in between those two games. And if it's going to, I think this is going to be a hard-nosed game. I don't think this is going to be a super high scoring game. I think this is going to be like a 20-20 something kind of game. I just think this is a game that at the end of the day, Cincinnati's just not going to be able to keep up with Notre Dame from a point standpoint.
Yep.
And I think Notre Dame's going to be able to do enough against that Cincinnati defense to be able to make some big plays. And I think the Notre Dame defense is going to make some big plays to set up some points. I think this is a game that Notre Dame is going to win 7-17 points. And when I say 17, it's more of like a Cincinnati has to go for it on 4th down late in the game. 5 minutes left. They don't get it. Notre Dame punches it in to put it away.
Right.
That's what I mean by like a 7-17. Yeah, that kind of thing, where it's a competitive game and then they kind of put it away late, whatever. That's how I see it playing out. If Notre Dame doesn't protect the ball, that's when I think it could. If Notre Dame turns the ball over a couple times, that's how Cincinnati can win this game, because they don't need a lot of mistakes from Notre Dame to be able to turn the tide.
It's big plays and turnovers for me still with this game.
That's it.
If they allow a long run, or they allow somebody to get loose, Michael Young, and they score a touchdown, and they turn the ball over, that's how this game gets lost by Notre Dame. And yes, you could say that about every game, but it's very specific to this game.
And it doesn't have to be like 4 turnovers.
Right.
Like to lose to FSU, they're going to have to turn it over like 3-4 times. And just like one big play, like giving up one 70-yard touchdown on defense, and then one bad turnover deep in your own territory can be the difference between a 27-17 win and a 27-24 loss. Right. That's the thing.
Yes.
So it doesn't have to be like, oh man, they just kept stumbling over themselves and all these other kind of things. So that to me is kind of where I'm at with it. And so, that's where it's at. So that's the exciting thing. So
that's going to do it for our Cincinnati preview. Thanks everybody for hanging out. Again, we are not going to do a Q&A today, just because we've got kind of a loaded schedule today, and we did 2 shows for you yesterday, people. Come on. No,
hey, it's all right. Don't be like that.
I'm joking. I'm
we'll
totally
make it up to all of y'all tomorrow.
Yes. So the mailbag is tomorrow.
Yep.
make sure you jump
we
in.
will be at 1 p.m. for that one, okay?
Yes.
That one won't get pushed back. That one will be at 1 o'clock. If I have to join the chat in my car because I'm coming home from somewhere,
right?
There you go. That's where I'm at. So
yeah, no, it's going to be a lot of fun because I love Friday mailbags, and so we'll have that tomorrow. So thanks for joining us for that. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button, the like button, the notification bell, and make sure you share with your friends and family.
The message boards.
Yes.
Come join us. Come be a part of it.
Join those message boards because you also get a discount to the merch store. So, I mean, come on, people. There's benefits there. And if you're listening on a podcast, make sure that you hit that subscribe button and share with your friends and family because we want to be there. We want to help you guys enjoy this season because I think it's going to be a fun one. So for Brian, I'm Vince, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.